The sound of laughter echoed through the bank lobby. Wisdom clenched the termination letter in his hand, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. Just a day ago, he was the respected manager of this very branch. Now, his world was crumbling. "Did you hear? He got fired for theft," one colleague whispered. "I always knew he was too good to be true," another chimed in. Wisdom's heart sank. He had given everything to this job, sacrificing time with his family and friends to ensure the bank's success. And this was his reward? The security guard approached. "Sir, you need to leave." Wisdom nodded, swallowing his pride. As he walked out of the building, he noticed his car being towed away. His phone buzzed with a message. "Your accounts have been frozen. Further investigations pending." He stood on the sidewalk, staring at the bustling city streets. He was no longer the man he had been this morning. He was just another face in the crowd. The city buzzed with its usual chaos, vendors shouting prices, cars honking impatiently, and pedestrians weaving through the crowds. But to Wisdom, it was all a blur. His world had come crashing down in a single day. The termination letter felt heavy in his hand, even though it was just a piece of paper. Its contents replayed in his mind like a haunting melody. "Effective immediately, your services are no longer required due to discrepancies in financial records under your supervision." Discrepancies? Theft? The accusations were absurd. Wisdom had built his career on integrity and discipline. For 10 years, he had managed the bank with precision, turning it into one of the most successful branches in the city. Yet now, his achievements meant nothing. As he stepped out of the building, the familiar sight of his luxury car brought a flicker of comfort, until he saw two men in suits gesturing toward it. "What's happening?" Wisdom asked, his voice cracking. "Repossession," one of the men said curtly. "This vehicle belongs to the bank." "But this is my car. I paid for it." "It was financed through the bank," the man replied without emotion. "And your accounts have been frozen pending investigation." Wisdom's chest tightened as he watched them drive his car away. His legs felt like lead as he stumbled to the side of the road. People passed by without sparing him a glance. Just this morning, he had been someone important. Now, he was just another man on the street. His phone vibrated. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Maybe this was all a mistake, and someone was calling to apologize. But the message on the screen shattered that hope. "Your house will be sealed tomorrow. Please vacate the premises." He gripped the phone tightly, his mind racing. His house, his sanctuary, the place where he and Belinda had built their lives together, was being taken away. The weight of it all hit him at once. His chest heaved as he leaned against a lamppost, struggling to catch his breath. Around him, the city continued, indifferent to his pain. That evening, Wisdom returned home, dreading what awaited him. He opened the door to find Belinda sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. The television played in the background, but her expression was anything but relaxed. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You're home early. What happened?" He hesitated, then held up the letter. I've been terminated." Her brow furrowed, and she snatched the letter from his hand. As she read, her face turned red with anger. "Terminated? For theft?" she hissed. "What are you talking about, Wisdom?" "It's a mistake," he said, his voice shaky. "I've done nothing wrong." Belinda stood abruptly, throwing the letter onto the table. "A mistake? Do you think the bank would do this without evidence? You've ruined us." "Belinda, please," he began, but she cut him off. "Don't please me," she shouted. "What are we supposed to do now? The bills, the mortgage, everything. You've destroyed it all." Her words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. He wanted to explain, to make her understand that he had been framed, but how could he? He didn't even understand it himself. Belinda stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Wisdom sank into the worn armchair by the window, staring at the city lights outside. This house, this life, it was all slipping through his fingers. He thought about the whispers at the bank, the smug smiles of colleagues who had once envied his position. Someone had done this to him. Someone had set him up. But who? And why? As the hours dragged on, he felt the crushing weight of his situation. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and his reputation destroyed. And now, even Belinda was against him. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes. The memories of his once thriving career played in his mind like a cruel joke. The meetings, the accolades, the respect. It was all gone. In the silence of the night, he made a decision. He couldn't let this be the end. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to prove his innocence. But for now, he would have to endure. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Wisdom packed a small bag. He left the house without saying a word to Belinda, knowing she wouldn't care. He walked through the bustling streets, his heart heavy but his mind determined. He passed by shops, offices, and restaurants, each one a reminder of the life he had lost. Finally, he arrived at the market. The air was thick with the scent of spices, grilled meat, and sweat. Vendors shouted to attract customers, and wheelbarrow pushers darted between the stalls, carrying goods. This was where he would start over. He approached an older man leaning against a stack of crates. "Excuse me," Wisdom said hesitantly. "I'm looking for work." The man looked him up and down, his gaze lingering on Wisdom's polished shoes and neatly pressed shirt. "Work? You don't look like someone who belongs here." "I don't," Wisdom admitted. "But I need a job. Anything?" The man smirked. "You can push wheelbarrows if you're strong enough." "I'll do it," Wisdom said firmly. The man handed him a battered wheelbarrow. "You're not going to last a day," he muttered. But Wisdom said nothing. As he gripped the handles of the wheelbarrow and stepped into the chaos of the market, he felt a flicker of resolve. They all laughed at him. They all doubted him. But they didn't know the man he truly was, or the fire that now burned within him. The market was alive with noise and chaos. Wisdom stood awkwardly at the edge, gripping the handles of his wheelbarrow. Around him, other pushers navigated the narrow aisles with ease, weaving through crowds of customers and vendors shouting their prices. He took a deep breath. This wasn't just a job, it was survival. His first customer, a middle-aged woman with a basket full of yams, waved him over. "Hey you, wheelbarrow boy." The word stung. Just a few days ago, he had been Mr. Wisdom, a respected figure in the banking industry. Now, he was wheelbarrow boy. Swallowing his pride, he approached her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, forcing politeness into his tone. "Take these yams to the car park," she ordered, pointing to a minivan parked far on the other side of the market. She tossed him a few coins. "And be quick about it." Wisdom nodded, loading the yams into the wheelbarrow. As he pushed through the market, sweat trickled down his forehead. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the smell of rotting vegetables and fish clung to the air. He wasn't used to this kind of physical labor. His hands, once used to typing on keyboards and signing documents, ached as he gripped the handles. His back protested with every step. People stared at him, some in pity, others with open mockery. "Isn't that Wisdom the banker?" one man whispered to his friend. "Huh, look at him now. Pride comes before a fall." Wisdom kept his head down, focusing on the path ahead. Every insult was like a jab, but he refused to let it break him. He delivered the yams and collected the woman's payment, a meager amount that barely seemed worth the effort. As the day dragged on, the work grew harder. Customers demanded speed and efficiency, often berating him if he was too slow. By noon, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his muscles screamed for relief. At one point, he stopped to rest under the shade of a fruit stall. The vendor, a young woman with a kind smile, handed him a cup of water. "You're new here," she said, her voice soft but curious. Wisdom nodded, gulping down the water. "Yes, I started today." "You don't look like someone who belongs in the market," she said, studying him. "What's your story?" "It's a long one," he replied, handing the cup back. "I'm Ada," she said, extending her hand. "If you ever need help, just ask." "Wisdom," he said, shaking her hand. For the first time that day, he felt a glimmer of hope. By evening, Wisdom was exhausted. His arms ached, his feet throbbed, and his stomach growled from hunger. He counted his earnings for the day, a pitiful sum that barely seemed worth the humiliation he had endured. As he sat on the curb, wiping his brow, he heard laughter behind him. A group of young men, clearly drunk, pointed at him and jeered. "Hey, wheelbarrow man, want to push us home too?" one of them mocked. Wisdom clenched his fists but said nothing. He had no strength left to argue. As the men stumbled away, he stared at the city lights in the distance. He had once been part of that world, a world of suits and ties, of power and respect. Now, he was here, at the bottom. But deep inside, something stirred. This wasn't the end of his story. It couldn't be. He didn't know how, but he vowed to rise again. For now, though, he would endure. As he pushed his empty wheelbarrow back to the corner where the pushers gathered, the sound of the bustling market faded into the background. He thought about the whispers, the mockery, and the jeers. "They all laugh now," he muttered to himself, "but they don't know who I truly am." The dim light in the apartment cast long shadows on the walls as Wisdom pushed open the door. His body ached from the day's labor, and his clothes reeked of sweat and the grime of the market. He longed for a warm bath, a decent meal, and maybe a kind word from Belinda. But as he stepped inside, the sharp sound of laughter greeted him. Belinda was seated on the couch, her legs crossed elegantly, a glass of wine in her hand. Opposite her sat Wisdom's younger brother, Desmond, who leaned back with the confident smirk Wisdom had always envied. "You're back late," Belinda said without looking at him, her voice dripping with disdain. Wisdom froze in the doorway, his heart sinking. The sight of Desmond in his home felt like an intrusion. "Desmond," he said evenly, "what are you doing here?" Desmond shrugged. "Just checking in on Belinda. You know, making sure she's okay, considering your situation." "My situation?" Wisdom echoed, stepping further into the room. His voice was calm, but his fists clenched at his sides. "Yes," Belinda interjected, her tone sharp, "your situation. The disgrace you've brought to this family." She stood and walked over to the dining table, where an untouched meal sat waiting. "I made dinner hours ago, but of course you're too busy playing wheelbarrow boy to come home on time." Wisdom's stomach growled at the sight of the food, but her words stung more than his hunger. "I'm doing what I can to keep us afloat, Belinda," he said softly. "Keep us afloat?" she scoffed, turning to face him. "Do you even hear yourself? You've dragged us into the gutter. Do you know how humiliating it is for me to walk around this city while people whisper about my husband, the former bank manager who now pushes wheelbarrows for spare change?" Desmond chuckled, sipping from his glass. "You have to admit, brother, it's quite the fall from grace." Wisdom shot him a glare but held his tongue. "I didn't ask for this," he said to Belinda. "I was framed, and you know it. I just need time to clear my name." "Time?" Belinda snapped. "We don't have time. The bills are piling up, the landlord is threatening to evict us, and you want to play detective? Face it, Wisdom, you're a failure." The word hung in the air like a slap. Wisdom's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Belinda turned back to Desmond with a soft laugh. "Thank goodness for Desmond," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "At least someone in this family is successful." Wisdom's stomach churned. The subtle glances, the easy familiarity between them. It all felt wrong. "Belinda," he said slowly, "what's going on here?" Belinda rolled her eyes. "Don't start, Wisdom. Desmond is just helping me us. Unlike you, he actually has the means to do so." Desmond smirked, leaning forward. "Relax, brother. I'm just lending a hand where you clearly can't." Wisdom's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Thank you for your concern, Desmond, but I don't need your help." Desmond stood, towering over him. "Don't mistake my kindness for weakness, Wisdom. You've lost everything, and I'm the only one keeping Belinda from walking out that door. Maybe you should be thanking me." The tension in the room was suffocating. Wisdom's gaze shifted to Belinda, searching her face for any sign of loyalty, of the woman who had once stood by his side through thick and thin. But her expression was cold, almost indifferent. Without another word, Wisdom turned and walked into the bedroom, shutting the door behind him. His hands shook as he leaned against the wall, his chest heaving with anger and despair. Later that night, Wisdom lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the city outside were a faint backdrop to the storm raging in his mind. Desmond's smirking face, Belinda's scornful words, they replayed over and over, fueling his frustration. He thought back to the early days of his marriage, when Belinda had been his biggest cheerleader. She had celebrated his promotions, encouraged him during long work nights, and shared in his dreams of building a life together. Now, she seemed like a stranger, a cold, bitter woman who had no faith in him. But it was Desmond's presence that gnawed at him the most. His younger brother had always been the reckless one, chasing fast money and living a flashy lifestyle. Yet now, he was the one sitting comfortably, acting like the savior. Wisdom clenched his fists. Something about Desmond's sudden generosity didn't sit right. But he had bigger problems to deal with, like surviving another day in the market. The next morning, as Wisdom prepared to leave, Belinda stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Are you just going to keep doing this nonsense?" she asked, gesturing at his tattered clothes. "Until I figure something out, yes," he replied, grabbing his bag. "Figure something out," she repeated mockingly. "You'll be dead from exhaustion before you figure anything out." Wisdom paused, looking at her. "Do you really hate me that much now?" Belinda hesitated, her gaze softening for a moment before she looked away. "I don't hate you, Wisdom. I hate what you've become." Her words were a knife to his heart. Without another word, he walked out the door, his resolve hardening. As he stepped into the bustling streets, Wisdom made a silent vow. They might mock him, betray him, even abandon him, but he wouldn't let this be the end of his story. One day, they would all see the man he truly was. The market was already alive with its usual chaos when Wisdom arrived, pushing his battered wheelbarrow through the narrow aisles. His body still ached from the previous day, but he forced himself to keep moving. The jeers and whispers that followed him now felt like background noise, a painful symphony he was learning to endure. By mid-morning, he had managed to secure a few jobs, earning just enough to buy himself a small loaf of bread and a bottle of water. As he sat under the shade of a mango tree near the edge of the market, chewing on the dry bread, he noticed a commotion nearby. A tall man in an expensive suit, flanked by two burly bodyguards, was making his way through the market. His polished shoes gleamed in stark contrast to the dusty ground, and his sharp eyes scanned the crowd as though searching for something or someone. The sight of such wealth and power in this setting was jarring. Vendors paused their shouting, and wheelbarrow pushers like Wisdom stepped aside to let the man pass. Wisdom watched the scene unfold with curiosity. Who was this man, and why was he here? The man stopped in front of a fruit stall, speaking briefly with the vendor. Then, to Wisdom's surprise, his gaze shifted and landed directly on him. "You," the man said, pointing at Wisdom. His voice was deep and commanding. "Come here." Wisdom froze. He glanced around, certain the man couldn't be talking to him, but the man's piercing eyes stayed fixed on him. Reluctantly, Wisdom stood and approached, pushing his wheelbarrow in front of him like a shield. "Yes, sir?" he asked, his voice cautious. The man studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're Wisdom, aren't you? Former manager of East Point Bank?" Wisdom's stomach churned. How did this stranger know him? I was," he replied hesitantly. The man nodded, as though confirming something. "I've heard about your situation. You've had quite a fall, haven't you?" Wisdom's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, unsure whether the man was mocking him or genuinely curious. "I'm Mr. Maxwell," the man continued. "I'm a businessman, and I've been keeping an eye on certain happenings in this city. Your story intrigues me." "Why?" Wisdom asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Maxwell smirked. "Because I don't believe in coincidences. A man like you doesn't fall so far without someone pulling the strings. And I'm very good at identifying who pulls the strings." Wisdom's heart raced. Was this man offering him help, or dangling bait? "What do you want from me?" Maxwell chuckled. "Straight to the point. I like that. I'm putting together a project, a venture that requires someone with your skills. You'll have to start small, of course, but there's potential for significant growth. Let's just say it's a chance to reclaim some of what you've lost." Wisdom frowned. It sounded too good to be true. "Why me?" "Because you've hit rock bottom," Maxwell said bluntly. "And men who've been to the bottom are often the ones willing to do whatever it takes to climb back up. Think about it, Wisdom. You're wasting away here, pushing a wheelbarrow and enduring humiliation. Or you could take a step toward rebuilding your life. Wisdom's mind raced. Maxwell's offer was tempting, but something about the man unsettled him. There was a sharpness in his gaze, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "I don't know," Wisdom said finally. "I'll need time to think about it." Maxwell nodded, pulling a sleek business card from his pocket. "Fair enough. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come often." He handed Wisdom the card and walked away, his bodyguards trailing behind him. The crowd slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but Wisdom stood frozen, staring at the card in his hand. It read, "Maxwell Holdings. Private Consultant. Contact 080-555-4321. He slipped the card into his pocket, his thoughts swirling. Who was Maxwell, really? And why had he singled Wisdom out? That evening, as Wisdom pushed his wheelbarrow home, his mind was consumed by questions. Maxwell's words echoed in his ears. Men who've been to the bottom are often the ones willing to do whatever it takes to climb back up. When he reached the apartment, he was greeted by the sound of laughter again. Desmond was still there, lounging on the couch with Belinda. They barely acknowledged Wisdom as he entered. Ignoring them, Wisdom went straight to the bedroom and locked the door. He pulled out Maxwell's card and stared at it under the dim light of the bedside lamp. He wanted to believe this was his chance, a way to rise above his current misery and prove everyone wrong. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Maxwell's offer came with strings attached. Still, what choice did he have? As he lay down to sleep, the card clutched tightly in his hand, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would call Maxwell. Whatever the risks, he couldn't afford to stay in this pit any longer. The laughter from the living room drifted through the thin walls, a cruel reminder of how far he'd fallen. But deep inside, a spark of hope began to burn. The morning sunlight crept through the cracks in the curtains, painting streaks of light on the battered walls of Wisdom's bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed, Maxwell's business card in his hand. His thumb traced over the embossed letters as doubts gnawed at his mind. What if this is another trap? He thought. What if Maxwell is just another person trying to take advantage of me? But then he thought of the market, the jeers, the stares, the humiliation. He thought of Belinda and Desmond, laughing at his misery. He had to take a risk. Anything was better than his current reality. Taking a deep breath, Wisdom pulled out his old phone. The screen cracked but still functional. His fingers hesitated over the keypad before he finally dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a smooth, confident voice answered. "Maxwell Holdings. How can I help you?" "This is Wisdom," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous flutter in his chest. "We spoke yesterday in the market." "Ah, Mr. Wisdom," Maxwell said, his tone light but commanding. "I was wondering when you'd call. Have you made your decision?" "I'd like to hear more about your offer," Wisdom replied carefully. "Excellent," Maxwell said. "Meet me at Blue Orchid Cafe in the city center at noon. It's a discreet place, perfect for our discussion. Don't be late." The line went dead before Wisdom could respond. He stared at the phone, unsure whether to feel excited or apprehensive. By noon, Wisdom stood outside the Blue Orchid Cafe, his wheelbarrow left behind at the corner of the street. The cafe was a stark contrast to the dusty market, a sleek, modern building with glass walls and a neatly manicured garden. Through the windows, he could see well-dressed patrons sipping coffee and typing on laptops. Wisdom adjusted his shirt, suddenly feeling out of place in his worn clothes. But he squared his shoulders and stepped inside. Maxwell was seated at a corner table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He spotted Wisdom immediately and gestured for him to sit. Punctual. "I like that," Maxwell said, offering a small smile. Wisdom sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I'm here to listen," he said. "What exactly is this project you mentioned?" Maxwell leaned back, his eyes scanning Wisdom as though evaluating him. "Let me be honest with you, Wisdom. I run a network of businesses, some traditional, some unconventional. What I'm offering you is a chance to manage one of these ventures." Wisdom frowned. "What kind of venture?" "A logistics operation," Maxwell said smoothly. "You'll oversee the movement of goods across the city. It's nothing illegal, if that's what you're worried about." but it does require discretion and resilience. The words hung in the air, vague but enticing. Why me? Wisdom asked again. As I said before, I have an eye for talent, Maxwell replied. I've done my research on you. You were one of the best managers in your field before your unfortunate circumstances. I believe you have the skills to excel in this role. And what's the catch? Wisdom pressed. Maxwell chuckled. You're sharp. Good. The catch, if you can call it that, is loyalty. If you join me, you're expected to see things through. No backing out, no questions asked. In return, I'll pay you handsomely and provide the resources you need to rebuild your life. Wisdom's heart pounded. The offer was tempting, but the lack of details made him uneasy. I need time to think, he said. Maxwell nodded. Take all the time you need, he said, sliding a sleek envelope across the table. Inside is an advance payment and the address of the warehouse where you'll begin if you accept. Show up there tomorrow morning, and your new life starts. Don't show up, and we'll consider this conversation forgotten. Wisdom picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling. He could feel the weight of the cash inside. Maxwell's eyes bore into him, sharp and unyielding. Think carefully, Wisdom, Maxwell said. Opportunities like this don't knock twice. That night, Wisdom sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the envelope. Inside was more money than he had earned in weeks, enough to clear some debts and buy himself some breathing room. But Maxwell's words echoed in his mind. No backing out, no questions asked. Was he stepping into something dangerous? Or was this his only chance to escape the abyss he had fallen into? From the living room, he heard Belinda and Desmond's laughter again. The sound ignited a fire within him. He was tired of being the object of their scorn, tired of feeling powerless. He opened the envelope and pulled out the address written on a small card. His decision was made. Tomorrow, he would go to the warehouse. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it. The morning air was crisp as Wisdom made his way to the address on the card. The streets were still waking up, vendors setting up their stalls and early commuters rushing to work. Clutching the envelope tightly in his hand, he kept his head down, avoiding the curious gazes of the passers-by. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of the city, in an industrial area that smelled of metal and oil. It was an imposing building, its high walls painted a dull gray, with no sign or name to identify it. A single security guard stood at the gate, his sharp eyes scanning Wisdom as he approached. State your business, the guard barked. Maxwell sent me, Wisdom replied, holding up the card. The guard glanced at it, then nodded and opened the gate. Go inside. They're expecting you. Wisdom stepped into the compound, his nerves on edge. The yard was filled with large shipping containers, forklifts moving back and forth like busy ants. A group of workers in overalls loaded boxes into a truck, their faces grim and focused. Mr. Wisdom, I presume? The voice startled him. He turned to see a tall, slender woman in a tailored black suit approaching. Her sharp features and piercing eyes reminded him of Maxwell. Yes, he said cautiously. I'm Ms. Adele, she said, extending a hand. I'll be your direct supervisor. Follow me. She led him into the warehouse, past rows of shelves stacked with goods. Everything from electronics to crates marked with foreign labels. The hum of machinery filled the air, along with the occasional shout of instructions. This is where you'll be working, Adele said as they walked. Our operation is simple. We move goods efficiently and discreetly. Your job will be to oversee the logistics, ensure everything runs smoothly, resolve any issues, and report directly to me. Wisdom frowned. What kind of goods are these? Adele stopped and turned to face him. Let me make one thing clear, Mr. Wisdom, she said, her voice firm. You don't ask questions about the goods. You focus on the process. Is that understood? Her tone left no room for argument. Wisdom nodded reluctantly. Understood. Good, Adele said, resuming her brisk pace. You'll start today. We've already assigned a small team to you. Prove yourself, and there's room for advancement. Fail, and you're out. They reached an office at the back of the warehouse. Inside, a group of workers stood waiting, their expressions wary. Adele introduced them briefly, a mix of drivers, loaders, and clerks. This is your team, she said. Get to know them, and make sure they respect you. Leadership is earned, not given." With that, she handed him a clipboard and a radio and left the room, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. The day was a blur of activity. Wisdom found himself coordinating shipments, resolving delays, and mediating between frustrated workers. The job was physically exhausting and mentally draining, but it felt strangely familiar, like a distant echo of his days as a bank manager. By the time the sun began to set, he was covered in sweat and dust but felt a sense of accomplishment. The team had been skeptical of him at first, but by the end of the day, they were nodding in approval as he managed to resolve a complicated scheduling issue. As he left the warehouse, Adele approached him. "Not bad for your first day," she said, handing him an envelope. "Your payment. Keep this up, and you might just impress Maxwell." Wisdom took the envelope, his heart racing. Inside was more money than he had earned in a month at the market. "Thank you," he said, trying to hide his surprise. Adele's expression softened slightly. "Don't thank me yet, Mr. Wisdom. This was just the beginning. The real challenges are yet to come." That night, Wisdom returned home feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. For the first time in months, he felt like he had a purpose again. Belinda, however, barely looked up as he entered. Desmond was gone, but the room still carried the scent of his cologne. "Where were you all day?" she asked, her tone cold. "At work," he replied simply, holding up the envelope. "I got paid." Belinda's eyes widened at the sight of the cash. "Where did you get this kind of money?" "I told you. I got a job," he said, setting the envelope on the table. She eyed him suspiciously but didn't press further. Instead, she snatched the envelope and began counting the bills. "Finally," she muttered, "at least you're doing something useful." Wisdom said nothing, retreating to the bedroom. As he lay on the bed, the weight of the day settled over him. Maxwell's operation was unlike anything he had ever been a part of, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he discovered the true nature of the business. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of hope. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life. The laughter that had once haunted him was now replaced by silence, a silence that hinted at the storm yet to come. Wisdom arrived at the warehouse the next morning, determined to prove himself. He found Adele waiting for him in the office, her sharp eyes scanning a clipboard. Without looking up, she gestured for him to sit. "We have a situation," she said, her tone brisk. Wisdom leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What kind of situation?" Adele placed the clipboard on the desk and fixed her gaze on him. "A shipment scheduled to leave last night didn't make it. One of the drivers claimed mechanical failure, but I don't buy it. That shipment was critical to our clients, and now we're behind schedule." "What do you need me to do?" Wisdom asked, eager to show his capability. "I need you to get that truck back on the road and deliver the goods before noon. No excuses, no delays," Adele said, handing him a set of keys. "The truck is parked in Bay 7. Find out what happened and fix it. This is your first test, Mr. Wisdom. Don't disappoint me." Wisdom nodded, pocketing the keys. He left the office with a mix of anxiety and determination, his mind already racing through possible solutions. In Bay 7, Wisdom found the truck. It was an older model, its paint faded and rust creeping along the edges. The driver, a stocky man named Cola, stood nearby smoking a cigarette, his expression bored. "Cola?" Wisdom called out. The man turned, his gaze skeptical. "You're the new guy, right?" "Yes," Wisdom said, stepping closer. "Adele said there was an issue with the truck?" Cola shrugged. "Yeah, wouldn't start last night. Tried everything I could, but it's dead." Wisdom climbed into the driver's seat, inspecting the dashboard. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered weakly before falling silent. Frowning, he opened the hood and examined the engine. "What's this shipment anyway?" Wisdom asked as he worked. Cola smirked. "You're better off not knowing. Just get the truck moving." Wisdom ignored the comment, focusing on the task. After a few minutes of tinkering, he identified the problem, a loose connection in the battery. With a borrowed wrench and some determination, he secured it back in place. "Try it now," Wisdom said, stepping back. Cola climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life. He shot Wisdom an impressed look. Not bad for a newbie, Kola said, extinguishing his cigarette. Let's load up and get moving, Wisdom replied, already heading to the cargo area. The drive across the city was tense. Kola maneuvered the truck through crowded streets while Wisdom sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The cargo was sealed in large crates, their contents unknown, but the way Kola handled the vehicle suggested it wasn't ordinary merchandise. You've done this before, haven't you? Wisdom asked, breaking the silence. Plenty of times, Kola said, keeping his eyes on the road. But not every delivery is the same. Sometimes, things get complicated. Complicated how? Kola hesitated, then glanced at Wisdom. You'll see soon enough. Just stick to the plan, and you'll be fine. The truck eventually pulled into a secluded compound on the outskirts of the city. A group of men waited near a loading dock, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward as Kola parked the truck. You're late, the man growled. Had some engine trouble, Kola replied casually, climbing out of the cab. The man's gaze shifted to Wisdom, narrowing. Who's this? New guy, Kola said. Adele's orders. The man grunted, clearly unimpressed. Unload the goods. Quickly. Wisdom helped Kola open the cargo bay, revealing the crates inside. The men began unloading them with practiced efficiency, their movements swift and precise. As Wisdom watched, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this operation was off. The men handled the crates with an unusual level of caution, as though the contents were fragile or dangerous. On the drive back to the warehouse, Wisdom couldn't hold back his curiosity. What was in those crates? He asked. Kola shot him a warning glance. Didn't Adele tell you not to ask questions? She did, Wisdom admitted. But I want to know what I'm dealing with. Kola sighed, his grip tightening on the wheel. Listen, Wisdom. This isn't a 9-to-5 job. You don't get to know everything. Just do your part, and you'll be fine. Wisdom leaned back in his seat, frustration bubbling under the surface. He hated being kept in the dark, but he knew pushing too hard could backfire. When they arrived at the warehouse, Adele was waiting for them. Was the delivery successful? She asked, her tone sharp. Yes, Kola said. No issues. Adele nodded, then turned to Wisdom. You did well today, she said. Consider this a small step forward. But don't get comfortable. The real challenges are still ahead. That evening, Wisdom returned home exhausted but determined. His first test had been a success, but it had raised more questions than answers. What was Maxwell's operation truly about? And how far was he willing to go to climb back up the ladder? As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Wisdom couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into something dangerous. But for now, he had no choice but to keep moving forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back. Wisdom's confidence from the previous day was short-lived. The next morning, he arrived at the warehouse to find the atmosphere tense and charged with unease. Workers whispered among themselves, shooting nervous glances toward the office where Adele usually worked. What's going on? Wisdom asked Kola, who stood near the loading docks, arms crossed. Kola shook his head grimly. One of the shipments never made it to its destination last night. Maxwell's furious. They're saying someone tipped off the authorities. Wisdom's stomach churned. The authorities? Kola nodded. The truck was intercepted, but the driver managed to escape. Now, Adele's tearing through everyone's records, trying to find out who leaked the route. Wisdom swallowed hard. Though he had nothing to do with the missing shipment, the idea of being implicated in such a high-stakes scenario sent a shiver down his spine. In the office, Adele sat behind her desk, her expression colder than Wisdom had ever seen. Several workers stood before her, shifting uncomfortably under her piercing gaze. Trust is everything in this business, Adele said, her voice low and dangerous. And when that trust is broken, consequences follow. She picked up a tablet and swiped through it, studying something intently. Then, without looking up, she called out, Wisdom, come in. The other workers turned to look at him as he stepped forward, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and pity. You were assigned to oversee a critical shipment yesterday, Adele said, her tone sharp. Did you notice anything unusual? Wisdom shook his head. No, ma'am. Everything went smoothly. Adele studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. You're new here, so I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. But let me make this clear. Any sign of disloyalty will not be tolerated. Maxwell doesn't forgive betrayal. Wisdom nodded, his mouth dry. Understood. Good, Adele said, gesturing for him to leave. As Wisdom walked back to the loading docks, his mind raced. The stakes were higher than he had anticipated, and the slightest misstep could have dire consequences. Later that afternoon, Adele summoned Wisdom to the warehouse's conference room. Maxwell was there, seated at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Adele stood beside him, her posture rigid. Mr. Wisdom, Maxwell said, gesturing for him to sit. We have a problem, and I believe you can help us solve it. Wisdom sat down cautiously. What kind of problem? Maxwell leaned forward, his fingers steepled. The missing shipment contained sensitive materials. We need to locate it before it falls into the wrong hands. You've proven resourceful, and I believe you're capable of handling this. Wisdom's pulse quickened. You want me to find the shipment? Precisely, Maxwell said. You'll work with one of our top operatives, a man named Victor. He'll provide the details. Before Wisdom could respond, the door opened, and a man entered. Victor was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running along his jawline and an air of quiet menace. He nodded curtly at Maxwell before turning to Wisdom. Follow me, Victor said, his voice low and gravelly. Victor led Wisdom to a black SUV parked outside the warehouse. As they drove through the city, Victor filled him in on the situation. The shipment was last tracked near the old industrial district, Victor said. Our contact there reported unusual activity around an abandoned factory. That's where we'll start. Wisdom nodded, his nerves frayed but his determination firm. When they arrived at the factory, the area was eerily quiet. The building loomed before them, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Stay close, Victor said, pulling a pistol from his jacket and tucking it into a holster. Wisdom's heart raced as they entered the factory. The air inside was damp and heavy, the floor littered with debris. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. As they turned a corner, they heard voices. Victor signaled for Wisdom to stop and crouched low, peering around the corner. A group of men stood near a stack of crates, talking in hushed tones. One of them opened a crate, revealing its contents. Small, tightly packed packages wrapped in black plastic. That's it, Victor whispered. Stay here. Before Wisdom could protest, Victor stepped out of the shadows, his gun drawn. Step away from the crates, he ordered, his voice steady. The men froze, then scrambled for their own weapons. Chaos erupted as gunfire echoed through the factory. Wisdom ducked behind a pillar, his heart pounding in his chest. Victor moved with practiced precision, taking down two of the men before they could react. The others fled, leaving the crates behind. It's clear, Victor called out, motioning for Wisdom to join him. Wisdom emerged cautiously, his legs shaky. What now? Call Adele, Victor said, inspecting the crates. Tell her we found the shipment. That evening, back at the warehouse, Adele and Maxwell commended Victor and Wisdom for their efforts. You've earned my trust, Maxwell said, his gaze steady on Wisdom. But remember, trust is fragile. Don't give me a reason to doubt you. As Wisdom left the warehouse that night, his thoughts were a whirlwind. He had survived his first real test, but the experience had left him shaken. The line between survival and danger was thinner than he had ever imagined, and he wasn't sure how long he could walk it without falling. But for now, he had proven himself, and in this world, that was enough to keep him moving forward. The next morning, Wisdom arrived at the warehouse with mixed emotions. The tension from the previous day's events still lingered, but there was also a sense of accomplishment. He had proven himself in Maxwell's eyes, but the cost of that trust weighed heavily on his mind. As he approached the building, Adele intercepted him. Her usual cold demeanor was softened, though her eyes retained their sharpness. Maxwell wants to see you, she said without preamble. Wisdom felt his chest tighten. Now? Adele nodded. Don't keep him waiting. Maxwell's office was a stark contrast to the rest of the warehouse. Polished wood paneling, a plush carpet, and a glass desk gave the room an air of quiet power. Maxwell sat behind the desk, his fingers steepled as he watched Wisdom enter. "Sit," Maxwell said, gesturing to a chair. Wisdom obeyed, his nerves on edge. "You did well yesterday," Maxwell began, his tone calm but authoritative. "Victor spoke highly of you." "That's rare." "Thank you, sir," Wisdom said, trying to keep his voice steady. Maxwell leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I have another task for you. This one is delicate." Wisdom tensed. "What kind of task?" Maxwell slid a file across the desk. "There's a man, Mr. Harrison. He's a competitor, and he's been encroaching on my territory. I need you to deliver a message." Wisdom hesitated, his mind racing. "What kind of message?" Maxwell's lips curved into a faint smile. "A subtle one. You'll meet Victor tonight. He'll handle the details. All you need to do is follow his lead." Wisdom's stomach churned. He had a sinking feeling about this task but knew refusing wasn't an option. "I understand," he said finally. "Good," Maxwell said, leaning back in his chair. "Don't disappoint me." That evening, Wisdom found himself in the back of the same black SUV, sitting beside Victor as they drove through the city. The streets grew darker and quieter as they entered a secluded neighborhood. Victor handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This is the message," Victor said, his tone serious. "What's in it?" Wisdom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victor shot him a sidelong glance. "You don't need to know. Just make sure it gets delivered." They stopped outside a modest two-story house. The lights were on, and a car was parked in the driveway. "This is it," Victor said, opening the door. "Let's go." They approached the house cautiously. Victor knocked on the door, his expression calm but alert. A man in his 50s opened it, his face a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Can I help you?" the man asked. Victor smiled faintly. "Mr. Harrison, I presume?" "Yes," the man said warily. Victor motioned to Wisdom, who stepped forward and handed over the package. "This is for you," Wisdom said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Harrison took the package, his gaze flicking between the two men. "What is this?" "Open it," Victor said. Harrison hesitated, then tore open the package. Inside was a single black envelope with the initials M embossed on it. His face paled as he read the contents. "You can't be serious," Harrison said, his voice shaking. Victor's smile disappeared. "Maxwell doesn't make empty threats. Consider this your first and only warning." Harrison's hands trembled as he clutched the envelope. I'll stay out of his way. I swear." Victor nodded. "See that you do." Without another word, they turned and left, leaving Harrison standing in the doorway, visibly shaken. Back in the SUV, Victor glanced at Wisdom. "You did well. Most people panic their first time." Wisdom said nothing, his mind racing. The task had been simple, but the implications were chilling. Maxwell's reach was deeper and darker than he had imagined, and he was now a part of it. When they returned to the warehouse, Victor patted him on the back. "Get some rest. You've earned it." Wisdom nodded, forcing a faint smile. But as he walked away, a cold realization settled over him. He was no longer just a wheelbarrow pusher or a struggling man trying to survive. He was now entangled in a dangerous web, and there was no way out. That night, as he lay in bed, Wisdom stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Maxwell's world was consuming him piece by piece, and he couldn't help but wonder how far he would go, or how much of himself he would lose before it was over. Wisdom awoke to the faint sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy and still wrapped in the weight of his thoughts, he reached for it, rubbing his eyes as he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Adele. "Be at the warehouse at 9 a.m. Maxwell wants to see you." Wisdom exhaled slowly, the pressure in his chest increasing. The tasks he had completed for Maxwell thus far were minor compared to what might be coming. He couldn't afford to fail, but he also couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling inside him that each new step brought him deeper into a dangerous game. At the warehouse, Maxwell was waiting for him in the same conference room. His face was as calm as ever, but there was something different about the atmosphere. The air felt thick with anticipation. "Sit down, Wisdom," Maxwell said as he gestured to the chair across from him. Wisdom obeyed, his palms suddenly sweating. Maxwell studied him for a moment before speaking. "I'm impressed by your progress. Not many men would have handled the situation with Harrison so well. But this next task is different. It requires more than just following orders." Wisdom swallowed, his mouth dry. "What's the task?" Maxwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled once again. "We have a rival. His name is Roland. He's been encroaching on our business interests, and he's become a serious threat. I want you to infiltrate his operation, find out everything you can, and bring me the intel I need to shut him down. You'll be working with Victor on this, but this time, you'll be the one taking the lead." Wisdom's pulse raced. Infiltration. He had no idea how to break into an operation like Roland's, let alone gather intelligence without getting caught. "Why me?" Wisdom asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Maxwell's lips curved into a small smile. "You've shown initiative. I think you're ready for this. Besides, Roland is unpredictable. He trusts no one. I need someone with the right mindset. Someone who can blend in." It took all of Wisdom's self-control not to react to the unspoken implication. Maxwell saw him as disposable, a tool to be used and discarded. "But be warned," Maxwell continued, his tone hardening. "This won't be easy. There are no guarantees, and the stakes are high. If you fail, you'll regret it." Wisdom nodded, swallowing the growing fear in his throat. "I won't fail." Later that day, he met with Victor outside the warehouse. The older man looked even more intense than usual, his eyes narrowing as he studied Wisdom. "This is no simple task," Victor said, his voice low. "Roland is dangerous. He's built his empire from the ground up, and he doesn't trust anyone, least of all newcomers. You'll need to be careful, Smart." "I know," Wisdom said, his voice tight. "Where do we start?" Victor handed him a file, similar to the one Maxwell had given him weeks earlier. "Roland operates out of a nightclub on the east side of town. It's a front for his operations, a place where he does business with all sorts of shady people. You'll need to blend in, work your way into his circle. The goal is to gather information, but also to stay out of his radar. If he suspects you're spying on him, it'll be game over." Wisdom opened the file. It contained pictures of Roland and his associates, along with a map of the nightclub and its surroundings. The information was basic, but enough to get started. "Any advice?" Wisdom asked. Victor's eyes hardened. "Keep your mouth shut. Stay alert. And remember, if you get caught, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose your life." That night, Wisdom found himself standing outside Roland's nightclub, a sleek building that pulsed with neon lights. The music thumped from within, the sounds of laughter and chatter spilling out from the entrance. He had no choice but to walk through the door. The moment he did, he was greeted by the overwhelming scent of perfume, the flashing lights, and the chaotic hum of a crowd enjoying themselves far too much. Wisdom's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to calm down. The club's interior was nothing like he had ever seen. The walls were lined with dark leather booths, a long bar gleaming with top-shelf liquor, and a stage where women danced provocatively under flashing lights. Roland's world was built on excess, on indulgence, and on keeping people both satisfied and controlled. As Wisdom walked deeper into the club, he scanned the room for any signs of Roland or his inner circle. It didn't take long to spot a man sitting at a private table in the far corner, flanked by 2 bodyguards. His face was sharp, his eyes cold. Roland. Wisdom steeled himself. This was it. He needed to find a way in without drawing attention to himself. He took a deep breath and walked toward the bar, ordering a drink. As he waited, he overheard snippets of conversation from nearby patrons, most of them discussing business deals, shady transactions, and rumors of Roland's growing power. It wasn't much, but it was a start. After a while, a man in a black suit approached the bar, his eyes scanning the crowd. He stopped when he saw Wisdom, his gaze assessing. "You're new here," the man said, his voice cold but not unfriendly. "You looking for something?" Wisdom's heart skipped a beat. "Just here to enjoy the night," he said, his voice smooth. The man smirked. "Roland doesn't like people coming in here without a purpose. You'd be wise to remember that. Wisdom nodded, his mind racing. I understand. The man eyed him for a moment longer before walking away, but the warning had been clear. Roland was watching, and this was only the beginning. Later that night, Wisdom managed to slip away from the bar and toward the VIP section. He had to find a way to get closer to Roland without raising suspicion. As he approached the area, a bouncer stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Where do you think you're going? The bouncer asked, his tone hostile. I'm here to speak with Roland, Wisdom said, his voice steady. The bouncer raised an eyebrow. And who are you? Wisdom hesitated. A friend. I've got business with him. The bouncer's eyes narrowed, clearly sizing him up. After a moment, he motioned for Wisdom to move aside. Don't make me regret this, the bouncer muttered. Wisdom walked past him, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was closer now, closer than ever to the man who held the key to his fate. He had no idea what awaited him in Roland's world, but he knew one thing. There was no turning back now. Wisdom's heart raced as he entered the VIP section. The plush velvet couches, low lighting, and quiet murmur of conversations all seemed to fade away the closer he got to Roland's table. The men around Roland were sharp, their eyes scanning the room constantly, like wolves on the prowl. Wisdom knew it wasn't just the club that was dangerous. It was the man at the center of it all. Roland sat at the head of the table, his dark eyes assessing everyone in the room as if he could see through them. He looked up when Wisdom approached, his lips curling into a faint but cold smile. You're the new face, Roland said, his voice low, but carrying an undeniable authority. What brings you to my table? Wisdom's throat tightened, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. I've heard a lot about you, Wisdom said smoothly, taking a step closer. And I think we could do business together. Roland's smile didn't fade, but his gaze sharpened. Business? I don't do business with anyone I don't know. I'm not just anyone, Wisdom replied, keeping his voice calm. I've got information, connections. I can offer you something valuable. For a moment, Roland said nothing, studying Wisdom with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then, he motioned to the empty seat beside him. Sit, Roland said. Wisdom sat down carefully, avoiding eye contact as Roland leaned back in his chair, clearly intrigued. Tell me more, Roland said, his tone shifting from suspicion to curiosity. Wisdom took a deep breath. He didn't have the luxury of hesitation. I know about your operation in the East End. I know about your competitors and the people trying to edge you out. I know who's been getting too close to your territory. Roland's eyes narrowed. And how exactly do you know all this? Wisdom offered a half smile, playing it off as casual. Let's just say I have my sources. Roland studied him for another moment before speaking, his voice softer, more contemplative. You're not a typical employee, are you? Wisdom didn't answer directly, instead taking a long sip from his drink. He knew how dangerous it was to answer that question too openly. Roland had a way of reading people, and he couldn't afford to reveal too much too soon. Tell me something else, Roland said, his voice almost a purr now. What do you really want? Wisdom hesitated, feeling the weight of Roland's gaze. This was the moment to push for leverage, to plant the seed of trust or betrayal. I want a partnership, Wisdom said. You need eyes on the inside. I can be your man. I can give you information others can't. Roland considered this, his gaze flickering to the men sitting nearby before returning to Wisdom. There was a long pause, during which Wisdom could hear his own heart pounding. You think I need you? Roland's voice was calm, but the challenge in it was unmistakable. Wisdom kept his tone steady, not backing down. I don't think you can afford not to have someone like me. For a while, there was nothing but silence. Then, Roland finally smiled, the kind of smile that made a chill run down Wisdom's spine. You're bold, Roland said. I respect that. He leaned forward, his fingers brushing the edge of his glass. You want to play with the big boys, Wisdom? Let's see if you can handle the consequences. Wisdom nodded, his mind already working on the next steps. He couldn't afford to show fear now. Roland's demeanor shifted again, becoming colder, more calculating. I'll give you a chance. But understand this, You work for me now. If you fail or cross me, I will make sure you disappear without a trace. Wisdom's stomach churned, but he kept his face neutral. Understood. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and tense exchanges. Roland's world was ruthless, where loyalty was earned with blood, and betrayal was punished with brutality. Wisdom quickly learned that in this game, even the smallest mistake could lead to a swift and permanent downfall. He continued to meet with Roland, gathering information on his operations, his enemies, and his plans. Every meeting felt like walking a tightrope. He was in too deep to back out now, but every step forward seemed to bring him closer to the edge. A few days after his initial meeting with Roland, Victor called him. "We need to talk," Victor said, his voice gruff. Wisdom met him in a secluded cafe later that afternoon, far from the watchful eyes of Roland's men. "What's going on?" Wisdom asked, his voice low. Victor looked around before speaking. "You're in a dangerous position. You're playing both sides, and that never ends well. You've got Maxwell's trust, but Roland isn't the type to share power. One of these men is going to find out what you're doing, and they won't hesitate to use it against you." Wisdom clenched his fists. "I know, but what else am I supposed to do? Maxwell's counting on me." Victor's eyes narrowed. "You need to make a choice. If you want to survive in this world, you can't be a player on both sides. Sooner or later, you'll get caught in the middle." Wisdom ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. "I'm just trying to stay alive. And if that means working with Roland for a while to keep Maxwell happy, then so be it." Victor didn't respond immediately. He stared at Wisdom, almost like he was waiting for something, then sighed. "You're a smart man, but don't let your ambition blind you. You're already in too deep." That night, after a tense dinner with Roland's crew, Wisdom received an unexpected call. It was from Adele. "Wisdom, you need to come to the warehouse immediately," she said, her voice urgent. "Why? What's going on?" "You'll see when you get here," she replied, the gravity of her tone sending a chill down his spine. At the warehouse, Wisdom found Maxwell waiting for him, a cold look in his eyes. Adele stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him closely. "What's going on?" Wisdom asked, his pulse quickening. Maxwell didn't speak at first. He simply handed Wisdom a file. "Roland's men have been asking about you," Maxwell said, his voice low. "We've been keeping an eye on you, Wisdom, and it seems you've been playing both sides." Wisdom's heart skipped a beat. How had they found out? "You've been talking to Roland," Adele said, her gaze piercing. "We know everything." Wisdom's mind raced as the walls seemed to close in on him. He had no idea how they had uncovered his secret, but it was clear that his deception was no longer safe. Maxwell's eyes darkened. "I gave you a chance, but now, you've forced my hand. You're in more trouble than you think, Wisdom. You need to make a choice. You either work for me, or you work for Roland. But you can't do both." Wisdom's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but the truth was clear. There was no way out of this. And now, the only question left was, which side would he choose? The weight of Maxwell's words hung in the air, suffocating Wisdom. He stood motionless, trying to process the reality of the situation. In the span of a few weeks, he had gone from a respected bank manager to a man caught between two dangerous forces. He had lived his life with integrity, until now. Now, he was forced to choose between two ruthless men who had no qualms about using him for their own gain. Maxwell's gaze remained unwavering, the icy chill in his eyes making it clear that there was no room for negotiation. "You've made your bed, Wisdom," Maxwell continued, his voice like gravel. "You've crossed a line, and there's no going back. The only thing that matters now is which side you're going to stand on." Wisdom felt his throat tighten as he tried to steady his breathing. His mind was a blur of thoughts and calculations. Roland had the power, but Maxwell had the loyalty he'd built over years. The stakes were too high for any misstep. Wisdom started, but the words stuck in his throat. "You can't afford indecision," Maxwell interrupted, his tone sharp. "You need to make a choice, and you need to make it now." Adele, standing silently by Maxwell's side, folded her arms. Her cold, calculating eyes bore into Wisdom, her silence adding to the growing tension. She had been the one to gather the intel, the one who had put the pieces together. Wisdom knew that she had no patience for weakness. For a moment, Wisdom felt as if the walls were closing in on him, his chest tightening with the weight of his choices. He had played both sides for as long as he could, but now the time had come to commit. "Why not just cut me loose?" Wisdom asked, his voice strained. "If you know about Roland, why don't you just let me go?" Maxwell's lips twitched into a half-smile. "You think it's that easy? You think I'll let a loose thread like you slip away, knowing everything you know about me and my operations?" Wisdom's heart raced, the suffocating reality of his situation sinking deeper into his bones. He had been naive to think he could play both sides for too long. Now, the price of his decisions was laid bare. "I'm not asking for your mercy," Wisdom said, his voice firmer now. "I just need a way out." Maxwell's eyes narrowed, his smile gone. "You don't get a way out, Wisdom. Not unless you prove yourself." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "And right now, the only way to prove yourself is to pick a side." Adele uncrossed her arms, stepping forward, her presence as cold and imposing as ever. "You need to decide," she repeated. "The longer you hesitate, the more dangerous it will become for you. You know how this works." Wisdom's mind raced. He thought of Roland, the power, the ruthlessness, the dark allure of the life Roland offered. Then, he thought of Maxwell, the man who had given him a second chance, the one who had shown him what loyalty could bring. But the truth was, neither of them cared for him. They cared only for what he could do for them. It was the stark reality of this world, a world Wisdom had once been so far removed from. Now, it was his prison, and he was the one who had built the bars. His fingers clenched into fists. "I'll choose Maxwell," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Maxwell raised an eyebrow, as though surprised. "Really? After everything you've seen of my world, you still want to stand by my side?" Wisdom nodded, his jaw set. "I made my choice." The decision felt final, but the moment the words left his lips, a wave of dread washed over him. It wasn't just about the choice between Maxwell and Roland. It was about what he had become. In his pursuit of survival, Wisdom had lost himself. He was no longer the man who walked away from a stable career to protect his integrity. He was a puppet now, controlled by the very men he had once believed to be above his reach. Maxwell seemed to assess Wisdom for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod of approval. "I knew you'd make the right choice." He stood up from his desk and walked toward the door, opening it with a single motion. "Adele will fill you in on the next steps. Don't disappoint me." As Maxwell exited the room, Adele's sharp eyes lingered on Wisdom, as if she were sizing him up. "You made the right choice," she said, her voice low, almost contemplative. "But that doesn't mean things will be easy for you." "I'm ready," Wisdom replied, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed himself. Adele gave a small, humorless smile. "Ready? You'll have to be. You're in now, and you'll have to prove yourself every step of the way." Later that day, Wisdom found himself back in the streets, the weight of his decision hanging heavily over him. Maxwell's world had always been dark, but now he was entrenched in it. He couldn't go back. He had burned all his bridges. As he pushed his wheelbarrow through the crowded streets, the familiar sound of wheels scraping against the pavement seemed distant, like a faint echo of a life he had left behind. Every glance he received from the pedestrians was a reminder of the man he used to be and the man he had now become. Days passed, and with each passing one, Wisdom found himself drawn further into Maxwell's operations. He was given more responsibility, more dangerous tasks, each one more demanding than the last. But no matter what he did, the question that lingered in the back of his mind grew louder. Had he made the right choice? As the pressure mounted, so did his doubt. He'd chosen Maxwell, but at what cost? The life of luxury he had once known seemed like a distant memory now, slipping further and further away with each task he completed. He couldn't afford to look back. He had committed to a path that led only forward, and the future was becoming harder and harder to see. The more he worked for Maxwell, the more he realized how much danger he was truly in. Maxwell didn't forgive mistakes. And Roland was still out there, watching. As Wisdom looked out over the city skyline from his small, modest apartment, a far cry from the mansions he once owned, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the choices that still lay ahead. The life he had built had been destroyed by betrayal, but now, he had to decide. Was the price of power worth it? The line between ally and enemy was beginning to blur. And in this world, it wasn't always clear which side he was on. Days turned into weeks, and Wisdom's life became a blur of clandestine meetings, covert operations, and whispered conversations in darkened corners. His existence had morphed into something unrecognizable, an amalgamation of past mistakes, present deceit, and an uncertain future. Each task Maxwell set for him was another link in the chain, binding him ever more tightly to a life of secrecy and danger. Maxwell, as expected, showed no mercy in his demands. Wisdom found himself increasingly involved in the darker aspects of the business. Money laundering, negotiating with dangerous rivals, and ensuring that none of Maxwell's enemies got too close. With every job, the stakes grew higher, and his once clear conscience became clouded with the weight of his choices. But it wasn't the work itself that gnawed at him. It was the constant fear that everything could come crashing down at any moment. Wisdom had chosen Maxwell, but Roland was still out there, and his reach was long. Roland had built an empire of influence and power, and Wisdom knew that it was only a matter of time before Roland realized that Wisdom had crossed the line. The same line that, once crossed, had no return. It was one late evening when the first real sign of trouble appeared. Wisdom was returning from one of his routine errands for Maxwell, nothing out of the ordinary, just another trip to a warehouse to finalize a transaction. But as he made his way through the darkened streets, the feeling of being watched hit him like a cold breeze. It was subtle at first, a lingering sensation, a whisper at the back of his mind. But the feeling grew stronger as he walked, and by the time he reached the corner of a deserted alley, the hairs on his neck stood up. His hand instinctively moved to his jacket pocket, where he kept his concealed gun. He had grown accustomed to carrying it ever since stepping into Maxwell's world, where danger lurked at every corner. But tonight, the fear wasn't just the possibility of being ambushed. It was the sense that someone was already waiting for him. Before he could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows. The tall, imposing man blocked his path, his features obscured by the dim streetlight. Wisdom's heart raced, his mind going into overdrive, trying to make sense of the situation. "You've been busy," the man said, his voice deep and clipped. It was a voice Wisdom knew well. Roland. His breath caught in his throat as the man stepped closer, his cold eyes scanning him from head to toe. Roland's men were always well dressed, always well prepared. This man wasn't just any lackey. He was someone sent by Roland, someone who knew exactly how to deliver a message. "I thought I'd give you a little reminder," Roland continued, his lips curling into a slow, menacing smile. "You thought you could slip away into Maxwell's world without me noticing? Think again, Wisdom." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Wisdom's hand tightened on the grip of his gun, but he knew better than to make any hasty moves. Roland's men were trained to watch for any sign of weakness, and one wrong move would be the end. "I don't know what you're talking about," Wisdom said, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. He kept his posture steady, his eyes locking onto Roland's, as if he were trying to will his way out of this encounter. Roland's smile widened. "Of course you don't. But I know everything about you. I know where you've been, who you've been meeting, and what you've been up to. You thought Maxwell would protect you? Well, you're mistaken." Wisdom's mind raced as he tried to piece together the situation. How had Roland found him? Had someone betrayed him? Had it been Victor, the only person who had seemed to believe in him after the fall? Or had Adele known all along, keeping an eye on him while she played the part of Maxwell's loyal assistant? Roland took a step forward, his gaze intense. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Wisdom. And in this game, there's only one winner. You can choose to keep playing, but trust me, you won't be the one left standing." The tension in the air was thick, and Wisdom knew that if he didn't act now, Roland would have the upper hand. But before he could make a move, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Leave him alone." Adele emerged from the shadows, her figure suddenly appearing at Wisdom's side. The surprise on Wisdom's face was evident. He hadn't expected her to be involved in this confrontation, especially not after their last encounter. But there she was, her face unreadable, her posture tense. Roland didn't flinch, his gaze never leaving Wisdom. "Adele," he said, his tone cold. "You're siding with him now?" Adele's eyes narrowed. "I'm not siding with anyone. But Wisdom's worth more to us alive than dead." Wisdom's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. What was Adele's game? Was she protecting him? Or was she using this moment to manipulate Roland into thinking she was still on his side? Roland studied her for a long moment before giving a short, humorless laugh. "Alive? You think Maxwell will let you keep him around? Or do you think you have him wrapped around your finger?" Adele's eyes flickered briefly with something. Anger? Regret? Before she stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "You underestimate him, Roland. He's no longer a pawn in your game." Wisdom, confused and uncertain, turned to Adele. "What do you mean?" But before she could respond, Roland's expression darkened. "Enough of this. I gave you a chance, Wisdom. Now you've chosen the wrong side. I'll make sure of that." He snapped his fingers, and two men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by masks. They were quick, efficient, and trained for one thing, taking care of business. But before they could reach Wisdom, Adele acted. With lightning speed, she drew a gun from her waistband and fired two quick shots, each one aimed precisely at the two men's legs. They dropped to the ground, their faces contorting in pain, unable to move. Roland's eyes widened in shock, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "This won't save you, Adele. You're all dead." But Adele remained calm, her gun still trained on Roland. "We'll see about that." The next few moments were a blur of chaos. Roland's men scrambled to regain control of the situation, but Adele was swift, her movements calculated and deadly. Wisdom stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't what he had envisioned when he made his choice to work for Maxwell. "Get in the car," Adele said, her voice sharp as she grabbed him by the arm. "Now." Without thinking, Wisdom allowed her to pull him toward the black SUV parked at the end of the alley. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, signaling that the situation was about to escalate even further. But for the moment, they were safe, at least, for the time being. As the doors slammed shut and the car sped off into the night, Wisdom's mind raced. What had just happened? Why had Adele intervened? And more importantly, what did this mean for him? The game had changed. The rules had shifted, and Wisdom was no longer sure who he could trust. The car sped through the dark streets, the tires screeching against the asphalt as it took sharp turns, heading deeper into the heart of the city. Wisdom sat in the back seat, his hands clenched, still trying to comprehend what had just transpired. Roland, his former employer, the man who had shaped so much of his life, was now an enemy in the truest sense of the word. And Adele had saved him. But for what reason? His mind whirred as he processed the last few moments. Roland's icy demeanor and chilling threat still echoed in his ears, but what truly puzzled him was Adele's involvement. He had thought she was Maxwell's loyal right hand. Had she really been playing both sides all this time? Or was there something else at work here? The tension in the car was thick, and the silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Adele's eyes remained focused on the road, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. She didn't look back at Wisdom once during the drive, as if she had made the decision to leave him to his thoughts. Finally, after what felt like an age, the car slowed down and turned into a narrow, dimly lit alley. It stopped in front of a nondescript building that appeared to be little more than a warehouse. The surrounding area was deserted, the air heavy with the smell of damp concrete and rusting metal. There were no signs, no indication of what lay inside. Adele turned off the engine, and the car's silence felt deafening. Wisdom's chest tightened as she stepped out of the vehicle without a word, leaving him no choice but to follow. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. This was a moment of reckoning. "Come on," Adele's voice cut through the silence, low and urgent. "We don't have time for questions." Wisdom hesitated for a moment, but then stepped out of the car, his legs feeling heavy beneath him. The cool air hit his skin as he walked toward the entrance, the tension of the past few days still gnawing at him. They entered through a side door, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the empty walls as they made their way through a dimly lit corridor. The place smelled of dust, age, and secrecy. After a few minutes of walking, Adele stopped in front of a steel door. She typed a code into a keypad, and with a soft click, the door swung open. It was a small, hidden office, tucked away in the depths of the city. A safe house, he assumed. Inside, a man in his mid-40s sat at a desk, his back to them. He was tall, with a scar running down the left side of his face, and he was wearing a well-tailored suit that made him seem out of place in such a rundown area. "Good to see you, Adele," the man said without turning around. His voice was smooth, but carried an edge of authority. "And I see we have company." Wisdom froze at the sound of his voice. There was something eerily familiar about him, like a shadow from his past, but he couldn't quite place it. Adele didn't respond right away. She walked toward the desk and placed a folder on it, her movements deliberate. "We need to talk. About Roland. And about everything that's been happening." The man slowly turned his chair, revealing his face. Wisdom's heart skipped a beat. The man in front of him was none other than Victor, the very brother who had been the one person Wisdom had confided in after his fall from grace. The same brother who had promised to help him, yet had seemingly vanished when the dust settled. "Victor," Wisdom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What how?" Victor smiled, a sharp, knowing smile. "Surprised? Huh? I never thought you'd be caught in this mess, Wisdom. But then again, you always had a way of getting entangled in things you couldn't control." Wisdom felt the weight of his words sink in. For all these years, he had trusted Victor, and now, the truth was staring him in the face. Victor had known more about this world than he had ever let on. The betrayal was clear. "You're working with Maxwell," Wisdom said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're helping him?" Victor nodded, his eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating light. "Maxwell's operations are more far-reaching than you could ever imagine. He's not just a businessman. He's the tip of the iceberg. We've been building something bigger than anything Roland could ever dream of. And you, Wisdom, you've been an important piece of that." Adele folded her arms across her chest and leaned against the wall. "That's why we're here. We've been keeping an eye on you, and now that Roland's sniffing around, things are about to get real messy. Maxwell needs to know you've made a choice. And you've chosen us." Wisdom's head spun. The betrayal ran deeper than he had ever thought. Victor, his own brother, was in the thick of this criminal empire. But even more shocking was that Adele, the woman he had come to trust, had always been part of this larger plan. "So, that's it then?" Wisdom's voice was bitter, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You all used me, and now I'm supposed to play along?" Victor's expression softened slightly, though the coldness never fully left his eyes. "It's not like that, Wisdom. This is bigger than you, bigger than me. Roland was always going to be a problem, but now you can help us solve it. You've got the skills, the experience. We're not just asking for your loyalty. We're asking for your expertise." Wisdom felt a surge of frustration. His mind was in turmoil, torn between the bitter reality of his situation and the remnants of the man he used to be. The man who had once held high ideals and dreams of success without compromising his morals. Now, all of that seemed like a distant memory, slipping away as he took one step deeper into the world he had never truly understood. "You want me to work for you," Wisdom said, his voice low, as though he were speaking to himself more than anyone else. "And if I don't?" Victor's smile didn't waver. "If you don't, Roland will come for you. And I can't guarantee that even we'll be able to protect you. But if you do, if you help us take Roland down, you'll have more power, more freedom than you ever dreamed of. All you have to do is stay with us, Wisdom. You've already made your first choice. Now, make the second." The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with the promise of more bloodshed, more choices, and more power. But the question still lingered in Wisdom's mind. Was it too late for him to turn back? Could he truly trust these people who had manipulated him all this time? Or was he already too deep in to escape? Wisdom glanced at Adele, her expression unreadable. then at Victor, whose cold smile seemed to say everything he needed to know. They were in this together, whether he liked it or not. One thing was clear. This was a turning point. There was no going back now. The choice had been made, and the consequences of that choice were unfolding before him. As the door to the room closed, sealing him into this new world, Wisdom couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. The days that followed felt like a blur of decisions and fleeting moments. Wisdom's life had transformed into a series of choices, each one more difficult than the last. He found himself walking a tightrope between loyalty to his brother, Victor, and the shadow of his former self. The man who had once been a respected bank manager with a clean conscience and a secure future. But now, all that remained was a man entangled in a web of lies, deceit, and power struggles. In the days following his meeting with Victor, Wisdom spent his time shuttling between safe houses, attending clandestine meetings with Maxwell's associates, and learning the true depths of the empire that had now claimed him. The world that Maxwell had built was vast, stretching far beyond the boundaries of legitimate business. Money laundering, international trafficking, weapons deals, and far darker dealings. Everything was connected in a way that left Wisdom feeling as though he were drowning in a world where right and wrong no longer existed. Only power, manipulation, and survival. Yet, there were moments when his mind wandered back to the life he once knew. He missed the simplicity of his old world, the comfort of knowing where he stood. But that man was gone now. There was no returning to the way things were. The truth had become too clear. Once you crossed certain lines, you couldn't go back. And now, Wisdom's every decision felt as though it was leading him deeper into a place from which he could never escape. It was late one evening when the first crack in the carefully constructed facade appeared. Wisdom had just returned from a particularly tense meeting with Maxwell's international contacts. He had learned that Roland was growing more powerful by the day, using his vast resources to move swiftly through the shadows, consolidating power. Maxwell, ever the master of control, was aware of the looming threat, but Wisdom couldn't shake the feeling that Roland's rise was unstoppable. There was something about the way Roland operated that made even the most seasoned criminals wary of him. He was patient, calculating, and always a few steps ahead. As Wisdom entered the dimly lit safe house, Adele was waiting for him in the small, nondescript living room. She sat on the edge of a couch, her face tense, eyes locked onto a set of documents spread out in front of her. She didn't look up when he entered, but Wisdom could sense her unease. "Maxwell wants you to attend the meeting tomorrow," Adele said, her voice sharp. "It's crucial. Roland's people have been making moves in the city, and we need to stay ahead of them." Wisdom nodded, still trying to shake the lingering anxiety from the meeting earlier. "I understand, but I don't know if it's enough anymore. Roland's power is spreading faster than we anticipated." Adele's eyes flickered toward him. For a brief moment, there was a vulnerability in her gaze that caught Wisdom off guard. But it disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold professionalism he had grown accustomed to. "It's not just about staying ahead of Roland," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's about the bigger picture. We need to make our move before Roland makes his. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." Wisdom's mind raced, but before he could respond, a knock at the door interrupted the conversation. His heart skipped a beat. The timing was too perfect, too coincidental. He exchanged a wary glance with Adele before she stood up to answer it. Adele opened the door to reveal a man dressed in black, his expression unreadable. He was tall, with a strong build, and his eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses that didn't match the night. Without a word, he stepped inside, a briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. His presence was unsettling, and Wisdom's instincts immediately told him that this man wasn't just another associate of Maxwell. He was something else, someone who had been sent for a specific purpose. The man placed the briefcase on the table, then turned to Wisdom, his face still shrouded in shadow. "The message has been delivered. Roland is making his move. Maxwell needs you to be ready." Adele didn't hesitate. She took the briefcase and opened it, revealing a set of high-tech surveillance equipment, blueprints, and a set of encrypted documents. "We've tracked Roland's movements for weeks," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "And now, we know exactly where he's going to strike. Tomorrow, the meeting will take place. We'll finalize everything, and we'll have the upper hand. Wisdom's heart began to pound as the pieces fell into place. This was it, the moment where everything would either be lost or gained. But as the realization dawned, another, darker thought crept into his mind. What's the real plan here, Adele? Wisdom asked, his voice low. Are we going to defeat Roland? Or are we becoming just like him? Adele's gaze softened for a split second before her mask of control slipped back into place. We're not the same as Roland, but we will do whatever it takes to ensure Maxwell's reign continues. That's all that matters. But Wisdom couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface of Adele's words. Something she wasn't telling him. As much as he had once believed in her, something had changed. Something was off, and it gnawed at him like a constant itch that he couldn't scratch. The next day, Wisdom found himself sitting in a dimly lit conference room, surrounded by the most powerful people in Maxwell's organization. The air was thick with tension, and every word spoken felt as though it carried the weight of life and death. Maxwell, seated at the head of the table, wasted no time getting to the point. Roland is close to making his move, Maxwell said, his voice low but commanding. We've tracked his operations, and we know where he's headed. But I need all of you to work together to ensure that we don't lose control of the city. This meeting will decide everything. Wisdom glanced around the room, his eyes locking onto each face. Some were familiar, associates he had met in his rise through the ranks, but most were strangers, their loyalty to Maxwell clear in their cold, calculating expressions. The tension was unbearable as Maxwell continued. The plan is simple. We strike first. We hit Roland's operations before he has a chance to react. And we do it fast. But even as Maxwell spoke, Wisdom's mind wandered. He couldn't help but think of the cost of all this. The lives that would be lost. The people who would be crushed beneath the weight of this empire. As the meeting stretched on, Wisdom's heart grew heavier. The room was full of men and women who saw nothing but power in their hands, and Wisdom realized that he had become one of them. No longer the man he once was, he was now just another cog in a machine that had no compassion, no mercy. And as the meeting ended, with Maxwell's voice fading into the background, Wisdom made a silent vow to himself. There was no going back, but maybe, just maybe, he could still find a way to make things right. The weight of the decision was starting to crush him. Wisdom's every movement felt mechanical. Every word that left his lips seemed hollow. The walls of the conference room blurred as his mind raced, a constant hum of thoughts he couldn't silence. He was about to make a move that would change everything, but deep down, he knew it wasn't the path to redemption. It was a path that led deeper into darkness. As the meeting dispersed, Wisdom lingered behind, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the door. Maxwell's voice echoed in his mind. We strike first. We hit Roland's operations before he has a chance to react. And we do it fast. The plan was clear. Swift, ruthless, and without mercy. Roland was dangerous, and Maxwell wasn't about to let him take control. But at what cost? Outside, the city hummed with life, a stark contrast to the chaos that was brewing beneath the surface. The streets were alive with noise, people hustling from one place to another, unaware of the storm that was quietly approaching. Wisdom couldn't shake the feeling that something vital, was slipping through his fingers. The city, once a place of hope and opportunity for him, now felt like a cage. Adele had been quiet during the meeting. She had sat next to him, as usual, her eyes focused, her posture perfect, and her expression unreadable. But Wisdom had noticed a slight tension in her shoulders, a flicker of doubt in her eyes that she quickly masked. It wasn't just Roland they had to worry about. There were other forces at play, other enemies lurking in the shadows. And Adele knew it. As he stepped out of the conference room, he found her waiting by the elevator, her arms crossed, her eyes distant. We need to talk, she said, her voice low, urgent. Wisdom followed her into the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind them with a soft hiss. The elevator descended slowly, the silence between them palpable. Wisdom couldn't take it any longer. What's going on, Adele? What aren't you telling me? She hesitated, her fingers tapping against her arm. You're not the only one who has a past, Wisdom. You're not the only one who's had to make difficult choices. The elevator dinged as it reached the ground floor, and they stepped out into the hallway. Wisdom felt his pulse quicken. I didn't ask for this, Adele. I didn't ask to be thrown into this world. And now, I'm supposed to help Maxwell destroy Roland? There's more to this, and I need to know what it is. Adele's face hardened, the soft vulnerability he had once glimpsed replaced by something colder, harder. She walked briskly toward the exit, and Wisdom had no choice but to follow her. They stepped out onto the busy street, the sounds of traffic and pedestrians filling the air. I'm not the person you think I am, Adele finally said, her voice barely audible above the noise. I wasn't just working for Maxwell when we met. I was working for Roland. I was sent to keep an eye on you, to keep an eye on Maxwell, and to make sure you didn't get too close. Wisdom stopped dead in his tracks, the words hitting him like a punch to the stomach. He couldn't process what she had just said. You were spying on me? Adele nodded, her gaze fixed on the ground. Roland knew you were capable. He knew you'd be a valuable asset. But Maxwell, he wanted you too. You were a prize to both of them, and I was the one who was supposed to make sure you never got too deep. Wisdom felt his world tilt. The woman he had trusted, the one who had been by his side through all the chaos, had been playing him all along. His heart sank, and anger surged within him. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was tight with fury, though he tried to keep it under control. Why play both sides? Adele's face softened, a trace of regret in her eyes. Because I didn't want to lose you. Because somewhere along the way, I started to care. I didn't want to be just a pawn anymore. Wisdom was silent, his mind spinning. He wanted to hate her, to feel betrayed. But there was something in her voice, something in the way she spoke, that made him hesitate. She wasn't just a cold operative. She was caught in the same storm as he was. And like him, she had made choices, awful choices, that had led her down a dangerous path. Now what? Wisdom asked quietly. What happens now? Adele exhaled, her breath shaky. Now we're both in too deep. Maxwell won't let either of us walk away. And Roland, she paused, her voice faltering. Roland is already on his way. We don't have much time. A loud car horn interrupted their conversation, and Wisdom looked up to see a black sedan pulling up to the curb. The driver, a man in a dark suit, stepped out and nodded toward them. It's time, Adele said, her eyes locking with his. We have to go. This is it. Wisdom followed her into the car, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. As the car sped through the city, the enormity of the situation weighed heavily on him. The lives of so many people were at stake, and it wasn't just about Roland or Maxwell anymore. It was about survival. His survival. The plan was set, but the consequences were unclear. There was no turning back now. Wisdom could feel the walls closing in around him, the pressure of the moment overwhelming. All his life, he had lived by a code of integrity, believing that he could rise above the corruption around him. But now, he was in the heart of it, and there was no way out except through the fire. The car took a sharp turn, and the city's skyline loomed ahead. Wisdom's stomach clenched as they neared a building in the heart of the financial district, the headquarters of Roland's operations. The final confrontation was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Inside the building, the battle for control of the city was about to reach its boiling point. Maxwell's forces were prepared to strike, and Roland's men were just as determined to protect their empire. But Wisdom wasn't sure if he was ready to play the role that had been set for him. Would he follow through? Would he do what it took to come out on top? The car stopped in front of the building, and Adele's eyes met his once more. This is it, she said. Let's finish it. As they stepped out of the car, Wisdom couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But with every step he took, the realization hit him harder. There was no escape now. The building loomed before them, its cold glass and steel structure reflecting the harsh lights of the city. It was an imposing fortress, a symbol of power and control that had stood at the heart of the city for years. The world outside seemed oblivious to the tension building inside its walls. As Wisdom stepped out of the car, he felt the weight of the moment like never before. Adele moved swiftly beside him, her face now devoid of the vulnerability he had once seen. She was all business, the professional operative he had first met when he was still a bank manager. But this time, there was something different about her, something sharper and colder. He didn't know if it was her training or the betrayal she had confessed to, but she seemed more distant now than ever. They walked through the sleek, marble lobby, the polished floors reflecting their every step. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty space. The air felt thick, the tension palpable. Every corner of the building felt like it was watching them, waiting for something to happen. And Wisdom could feel the weight of that expectation pressing down on him. He was about to cross a line, and there would be no going back. "Are you ready for this?" Adele asked, her voice low as they approached the elevators. Her eyes were fixed on the control panel, her finger hovering over the button. Wisdom didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure if he was ready. Could anyone ever be ready for something like this? He had spent years trying to climb the ladder, always aiming for success. Always trying to be the man his family and his colleagues believed him to be. But now, all that seemed so far away, like a distant memory. "I don't think anyone ever is," Wisdom finally said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "But it's too late to back out now." Adele nodded, pressing the button to call the elevator. They stood in silence, waiting for the lift to arrive. Wisdom couldn't stop thinking about the choices he had made that had brought him to this moment. Betrayal, manipulation, survival. It was all starting to blur together. There was no clear path anymore, just a series of calculated moves, each one more desperate than the last. When the elevator doors slid open, they stepped inside, and Adele pressed the button for the top floor. The hum of the elevator filled the silence between them. As the elevator ascended, Wisdom's thoughts raced. Was this the right choice? Was siding with Maxwell the only way to survive? Or had he just made a deal with the devil? "Maxwell's people are already in place," Adele said, breaking his thoughts. "We'll be in and out. But we need to move fast. Roland won't go down without a fight." "How do we know this is going to work?" Wisdom asked, his voice low. "What if we walk into a trap? What if Maxwell is playing us, just like Roland is playing him?" Adele turned to him, her expression unreadable. "We don't. But this is the only chance we have. If Roland takes control of the city, it's over for both of us. For all of us. Maxwell's the only one who can stop him. And if we don't take this chance now, we'll be lost forever." The elevator dinged as it reached the top floor, and the doors slid open to reveal a large, dimly lit corridor. The air was thick with anticipation, the sound of muffled voices and footsteps echoing down the hall. As they walked down the corridor, Wisdom's instinct screamed that something was off. He didn't know what it was, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. When they reached the double doors at the end of the hallway, Adele stopped and turned to him. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "Stay close. Don't let anyone see you unless I give the signal." Wisdom nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was the moment where everything would either fall into place or shatter beyond repair. He had no idea what to expect behind those doors, but he knew that once they stepped through, there would be no turning back. Adele opened the doors, revealing a large, dimly lit conference room. A long, sleek table stretched out before them, surrounded by high-backed chairs. At the far end of the room, Maxwell sat with a group of his most trusted associates. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an unspoken promise of violence. "Welcome," Maxwell's voice cut through the silence, his cold eyes fixed on Wisdom. "I trust everything is in order?" Adele stepped forward, taking her place beside Maxwell. Wisdom hesitated, his gaze shifting between the men at the table. He could feel their eyes on him, sizing him up, measuring his every move. It was clear that they didn't trust him. They never had. But this wasn't about trust anymore. This was about survival. "We're ready to move," Adele said, her voice calm and controlled. "We know Roland's location. His men are already in position. If we don't act now, he'll make his move tonight." Maxwell nodded, his face grim. "Then it's time. We hit him first." At that moment, the doors to the conference room flew open, and a group of armed men entered, their guns drawn. They were Maxwell's elite guards, and they were here to make sure nothing went wrong. Wisdom's pulse quickened as the tension in the room escalated. Everything had been building to this point, and now it was all about to unfold. But just as Maxwell was about to give the final orders, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and the door to the conference room swung open once more. This time, it wasn't one of Maxwell's men. It was Roland, the man who had been a shadow in Wisdom's life for so long. The man who had manipulated everyone in his path stood in the doorway, flanked by his own men. His smile was cold, calculating, too calm for the moment. Well, Roland said, his voice smooth and confident. It seems like we're all in the same place at the same time. Wisdom's heart raced as he realized what was happening. This was a trap. Roland had known about the plan all along. He had known they would try to strike first. Maxwell stood up slowly, his hand resting on the table. What is this? How did you? I know everything, Maxwell, Roland interrupted, his gaze flicking to Wisdom. Everything. And now, you and your little allies have nowhere to hide. The room fell into a heavy silence as the two forces faced off. The tension was unbearable, and Wisdom knew that whatever happened next, there would be no escaping the consequences. This was the point of no return. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every breath felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was thick with tension. Wisdom stood frozen, his eyes darting between Maxwell, Roland, and the armed men who surrounded them. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that with one wrong move, everything would crumble. Roland's cold, calculating gaze swept over the room, his lips curling into a smile that made Wisdom's stomach turn. There was no remorse in his eyes, no sign of fear. This was a man who had played this game for years, who had maneuvered through life like a master chess player. And now, he was about to checkmate them all. Maxwell, however, didn't flinch. He remained calm, his hand resting on the back of his chair, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. You always seem to be one step ahead, Roland, he said, his voice steady, though there was a faint edge of frustration beneath it. But this time you're wrong. Roland raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Am I? I don't think so. You see, Maxwell, you and I both know how this ends. You're out of your depth. You're not a part of this city anymore. Adele, standing next to Maxwell, shot a quick, almost imperceptible glance at Wisdom. It was as if she was silently telling him to stay alert. The subtle communication didn't go unnoticed, but Wisdom couldn't decide if it was a signal of trust or a warning. The tension was unbearable. It felt like an explosion waiting to happen. Roland took a slow step forward, his eyes flicking to Wisdom. And you, my dear friend, he said, his voice smooth as velvet, you've become quite the interesting pawn in this game. I must admit, I didn't expect you to come this far. Wisdom clenched his fists, feeling the weight of Roland's words. This was the moment he had feared, the moment where everything would come to light. He had been playing a dangerous game, trying to survive, trying to rebuild his life. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what it meant to have control, to truly be in charge of his own fate. Now, standing in front of the man who had destroyed his life, it felt like all his choices had led him here, to this room, with no way out. Maxwell finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. We've made our move, Roland. We're not backing down now. You've lost. Roland chuckled softly, the sound echoing in the stillness. I think you misunderstand, Maxwell. I haven't lost. It's you who's lost. And you, Wisdom, you're just another piece in my game. Always have been. The word stung, but Wisdom refused to show any weakness. He had come too far to back down now. The humiliation, the betrayal, the loss. He had endured it all, and he would not let Roland's smug arrogance break him. Enough games, Wisdom finally said, his voice firm, despite the chaos swirling inside him. If we're going to do this, let's do it. I'm done with hiding. Roland's eyes gleamed with amusement. Oh, I'm not hiding, my friend. I'm simply setting the stage for the inevitable. You think you can beat me? You think Maxwell has the upper hand? You're wrong. Everything you've done has been under my watch, under my control. You've all played right into my hands. Adele stiffened beside Maxwell, and Wisdom saw her reach for something beneath her jacket. A gun. It was a quiet, calculated move, and Wisdom knew it was the signal he had been waiting for. They had prepared for this. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a battle that was about to turn into a war. Without warning, Adele drew her weapon, her movements swift and precise. The gun glinted in the dim light as she leveled it at Roland's men. "You're too late, Roland," Adele said coldly. "This is where it ends." Chaos erupted in an instant. The room filled with shouts, gunfire, and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as people scrambled for cover. Wisdom's heart pounded as he dove behind the nearest pillar, his body instinctively reacting before his mind could process the danger. The sharp crack of gunshots filled the air, and the heavy thud of footsteps echoed through the room. Maxwell's men moved swiftly, returning fire with precision. The room was a battleground now, a place where survival meant everything. But amid the chaos, Wisdom could only focus on one thing. Roland? He moved quickly, ducking low and weaving through the gunfire as he made his way to the far end of the room. His body felt like it was moving on autopilot, driven by the need to end this once and for all. His thoughts were clouded with anger, with the need to take back everything Roland had stolen from him. Every betrayal, every lie, every manipulation. It all led to this. Roland, still standing near the door, had been caught off guard by the sudden attack. His men scrambled to respond, but the momentum had already shifted. Maxwell's forces were organized, efficient, and ruthless. The odds were no longer in Roland's favor. Wisdom reached the far corner of the room, his eyes fixed on Roland. The man hadn't moved, his expression still calm, as if he were merely an observer rather than a participant in the chaos. But Roland's eyes weren't on Wisdom. They were on something else, something behind him. Before Wisdom could react, a sharp pain exploded in his side. He gasped, stumbling forward as he felt the blood drain from his body. It wasn't a direct shot, but it was enough to send him crashing to the floor. His vision blurred as he struggled to remain conscious. He had been shot, but it wasn't Roland who had fired. Wisdom's gaze flicked to the side, where a familiar figure was emerging from the shadows, someone who had been missing from the game for far too long. It was Belinda. The pain was sharp, searing, and as Wisdom collapsed to the ground, it felt like his entire world had come apart at the seams. His vision swam in and out of focus as he struggled to stay conscious. The room around him was a blur of movement, gunfire, and chaos. But one thing was clear. The last person he expected to betray him was standing there, in the midst of it all. Belinda. Her face was cold, her eyes void of the warmth he had once known. She stood by the doorway, her gun aimed at him with practiced precision. The same woman who had once been his wife, the one he had built a life with, had just shot him. The realization hit him harder than the bullet that had torn through his side. Belinda? His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of pain, of betrayal. Belinda's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile. "You never really knew, did you?" Her voice was smooth, almost mocking. "You were always so busy chasing your precious wealth, your ambition, that you never saw what was happening right in front of you. I was never really yours, Wisdom. I was always Roland's." Wisdom's breath hitched as the words sank in. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from the pain, but from the horror of what she was revealing. All those years of love, of trust. Had they been a lie? Had it all been part of Roland's game from the start? "You!" Wisdom coughed, blood seeping from his wound, staining his shirt. "You were with him all along? You were working with Roland?" Belinda nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving him. "Not just with him. I was him. I was his eyes, his ears, his everything. You think you were the only one who was playing this game? No. Roland and I were always one step ahead of you. One step ahead of Maxwell. You were just the pawn, Wisdom, and I was the queen." Her words were like daggers, cutting deeper into his already broken heart. The woman he had loved, the one he had trusted more than anyone, had been part of the very thing that had destroyed him. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that she had been playing him, using him, all along. Maxwell, who had been fighting alongside his men, finally turned his attention to Belinda, his face twisted in disbelief. "You?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You were working with Roland this whole time?" Belinda didn't even flinch at his tone. "Yes," she said simply. And now you see. You've lost, Maxwell. This whole thing was always meant to be mine. It was never your victory. It was mine. It's always been mine. Wisdom tried to focus, his vision clouding with every passing second. He had to act. He couldn't let this be the end. Not like this. Not after everything he had been through. But as he tried to push himself up, the pain was overwhelming. His hand pressed against his side, feeling the warmth of his own blood trickling through his fingers. His body was weakening, but his mind was still sharp, still determined to understand why. Why had Belinda done this? What had driven her to betray him so completely? You were never enough for her, Wisdom. Roland's voice broke through the fog in his mind. You never were. She was always mine, and I always knew she would come back to me. You were just a distraction. Wisdom's heart sank further at the sound of Roland's voice. How had he been so blind? How had he not seen the truth that had been staring him in the face all along? Belinda looked over at Roland, her eyes softening as she acknowledged him. It's done, she said. It's over. We have control now. You can't stop it. Roland nodded, a satisfied smile crossing his face. Yes, it's over. And now, we begin the real work. Wisdom struggled to stay awake, his head swimming. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them take everything from him. His dignity, his life, his chance at redemption. There had to be a way out. Belinda, he croaked, his voice barely audible. You don't have to do this. You're not a part of this anymore. You can leave. You can still walk away. But Belinda didn't react the way he had hoped. She didn't hesitate, didn't even consider his words. She simply walked toward Roland, her heel clicking against the marble floor, each step echoing like a death knell in Wisdom's ears. This is who I am now, Wisdom, she said, her tone colder than he had ever heard. This is who I've always been. Her words struck him like a final blow, and as she disappeared into the shadows with Roland, Wisdom felt a deep, suffocating emptiness settle over him. She was gone. There was no saving her anymore. The sounds of gunfire and shouting continued around him, but they seemed distant, as though he were fading from the world. His vision darkened, and the room spun in front of him. But even in the midst of it all, there was one thing he knew for sure. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Through the haze of pain, Wisdom forced himself to focus. He had to survive. He had to make it out of this room. For everything he had lost, for everything he still had to fight for, he couldn't let this be his end. He wasn't going to die here, not like this. Maxwell's voice cut through his thoughts. Get him out of here, he shouted, his voice full of urgency. We're not losing him now. Two of Maxwell's men rushed forward, grabbing Wisdom under the arms and lifting him. The pain flared, but Wisdom fought through it. He couldn't afford to give up now. As they dragged him out of the conference room, Wisdom's eyes fell on the blood-stained floor. The faces of the men around him were a blur, but his mind was still focused on the one thing that mattered. Belinda was gone. Roland had won, for now. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Maxwell's men carried him down the corridor, the sounds of the battle fading behind them. The doors to the building opened, and they shoved him into the back of a waiting vehicle. The cold air hit him as they sped away, but his mind was still racing, still clinging to the hope that he could make it right. The city passed by in a blur, the lights flickering in the distance. Wisdom's thoughts were a whirlwind, and in that moment, one thing was clear. Roland and Belinda had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The car sped through the city's streets, its tires screeching against the pavement as it navigated through the night. Wisdom's head rested against the cool window. The pain from the bullet wound in his side still sharp, but the adrenaline had dulled it just enough for him to remain conscious. His thoughts, though clouded, were clear enough to understand one simple truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. They had failed. The plan had crumbled before their eyes, and the betrayal of those he trusted most had left him shaken to his core. Belinda's actions, her cold indifference, he couldn't fathom it. He had loved her, believed in her, but in the end, she had chosen power over love. She had chosen Roland. The city lights blurred outside, flickering like the last remnants of his old life. His wealth, his status. All the things he had once taken for granted now seemed so far away, so meaningless. The pain in his side was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. The woman he had built a life with, the person who had shared his most intimate moments, had shattered him without a second thought. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the reality that he had never truly known her. Maxwell's men had finally managed to get him to safety, at least for now. But Wisdom knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Roland and Belinda had the power, but they were not invincible. And Wisdom wasn't going to let them tear down everything he had fought for. The car veered into an alley, stopping in front of an unmarked building. The vehicle doors opened, and two of Maxwell's men pulled Wisdom out of the car, supporting him as he staggered toward the entrance. The cold night air stung his skin, but the pain from the wound was enough to keep him grounded, keep him focused. His mind raced with questions. What had he missed? How had Roland and Belinda been so organized, so precise? It was as if they had planned for every contingency, every move he had made. How had he been so blind? Inside the building, it was dark and quiet. The walls were bare, the space functional but unwelcoming. They led him through a maze of corridors until they reached a small, nondescript room at the back. The two men lowered him into a chair, and one of them immediately started to tend to his wound. Get him patched up, Maxwell's voice echoed through the room, calm but urgent. We'll need him on his feet again soon. Wisdom barely registered the words. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. He wanted answers. He needed to understand how it had all gone wrong. His fingers tightened into fists, the pain from the wound sharp and constant, but it didn't matter. He had a much bigger fight ahead of him. Maxwell sat across from him, his eyes scanning Wisdom with a careful, almost calculating expression. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken thoughts. We're not done yet, Maxwell finally said, breaking the silence. This isn't over. You're still part of this fight, whether you like it or not. Wisdom looked up, meeting Maxwell's gaze. You're telling me I still have a role to play? After everything that's happened? After everything Belinda and Roland have done? Maxwell nodded, his expression hardening. Yes. You think Roland's got the upper hand? He doesn't. He thinks he's won, but he's miscalculated. He's always been more of a showman than a strategist, and now he's underestimated us. Wisdom's mind raced as he tried to process Maxwell's words. Underestimated us? He asked, confused. You're telling me you have a plan to stop him? After all this time? Maxwell leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. We've been waiting for the right moment. Roland's strength lies in his secrecy, in his ability to stay out of sight. But we've got the resources, the network, and the knowledge to strike when he least expects it. You're not out of this, Wisdom. We still need you. The words hung in the air, but Wisdom felt the weight of them. He wasn't ready for another fight. Not yet. He was still too wounded, both physically and emotionally. His mind was a blur, his body aching, but the fire inside him, deep down, was still alive. There was something left in him, a determination to rise above, to do what it took to reclaim control. You think I can trust you? Wisdom asked, his voice hoarse. After everything that's happened? After everything you've kept from me? Maxwell's face softened, but only slightly. Trust is earned, Wisdom. I know that. But the situation we're in, it's bigger than you, bigger than me. Roland's vision for this city, for this world, is dangerous. It's not just about power, it's about domination. He'll destroy everything in his path to get what he wants. And right now, we're the only ones who can stop him. Wisdom swallowed hard, his throat dry. And Belinda? She's with him, isn't she? Maxwell's eyes hardened, and for the first time, Wisdom saw a flicker of something dark pass across his face. Yes, Maxwell said, his voice low. She's with him. But we can't afford to dwell on that. Not now. We have to focus on taking Roland down. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. Wisdom's mind spun as he thought about Belinda. He could still see her face in his mind. The coldness, the detachment. How had it come to this? How had the woman he had loved become an agent of his destruction? But there was no time for answers now. There was only one thing that mattered. How do we start? Wisdom asked, his voice steady now. The pain in his side still burned, but it was secondary. He had a mission now. There was a war to fight, and he wasn't going to let Roland and Belinda win. Maxwell stood, his eyes never leaving Wisdom. We start by taking back what's ours. We have to hit Roland hard, cut off his resources, and make sure he has no way to retaliate. We need to gather intel, rally the people who are still loyal to the old system. We need to take control before Roland can take control of everything. Wisdom nodded slowly, the fire in his chest reigniting. He wasn't done. He wasn't finished. He had a chance to fight back, to take back what was rightfully his. He might have lost a battle, but the war was far from over. And with Maxwell's help, they might just be able to win it. But deep down, a part of him knew that the cost of victory would be high. There would be more pain, more loss, and more betrayal. He had lost everything once before. But now, he would stop at nothing to reclaim it. The long road ahead would be treacherous, but Wisdom was ready. There was no turning back now. The quiet hum of the small room was broken only by the distant sounds of the city outside. Distant car engines, the occasional shout, the city's heartbeat. Inside, though, the silence was thick with plans and uncertainty. Wisdom sat on the hard, wooden chair, his eyes fixed on Maxwell, who paced back and forth across the dimly lit room. "All right," Maxwell said, pausing mid-step to face Wisdom. "We've got a lot to do, and not much time to do it." Wisdom nodded, his face grim. The pain from the wound was dulling, but the gnawing anxiety in his chest was still as sharp as ever. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now. Roland and Belinda were more dangerous than ever, and every second they delayed gave them more time to tighten their grip on the city. "What's the plan?" Wisdom asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Maxwell's eyes darkened. "We'll need to gather intelligence first. Roland's operation is vast, and his connections go deeper than we ever suspected. We've got to know what we're up against." "But how do we get that intel?" Wisdom asked. "Roland's smart. He's not just going to let us walk in and take it." Maxwell smiled, a cold, calculating grin that didn't reach his eyes. "No, but we have ways of making him talk. We've got a network of informants, people who have worked for him or have been close to his operation. If we can find the right people, we can start piecing things together." Wisdom's thoughts raced. He had always been good at reading people, understanding their motivations. But this was different. Roland had played him for a fool, and Belinda, his wife, had chosen him over her own husband. The betrayal cut deep, but Wisdom was learning that emotion had no place in a war. He needed to be focused, relentless, and above all, strategic. "All right," Wisdom said, his voice firm. "Who do we go after first?" Maxwell looked at him with a spark of approval. "You're right to be focused. There's no room for hesitation. Our first target is a man named Darnell Harris. He's been a key figure in Roland's organization for years, always in the shadows, always working behind the scenes. But he's vulnerable. We can get to him." Wisdom frowned. "What makes him vulnerable? Why would he turn on Roland?" Maxwell leaned in, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "Darnell has a weakness. A big one. His sister. She's been held hostage by Roland for the last few months. If we can get to her, we can get to him. Darnell is fiercely protective of her, and he'll do anything to keep her safe. Once he realizes Roland's grip on him is weakening, he'll come to us." Wisdom's mind raced as he absorbed the information. This wasn't just a game of power. It was personal. Roland wasn't just after money and control. He was willing to use people's families, their loved ones, to keep them in line. That made Darnell a valuable target. If they could break him, it would weaken Roland's operation from the inside. "And where is she?" Wisdom asked. Maxwell didn't hesitate. "We've tracked her down to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It's heavily guarded, but with the right approach, we can get in without alerting Roland. Once we have her, we can use her to force Darnell's hand. We need him to help us infiltrate Roland's stronghold, get to the heart of his operations. If we can do that, we'll be one step closer to bringing him down." Wisdom took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on him. This was risky. No, more than risky. This was dangerous. But there was no other choice. If they didn't act now, Roland's power would only grow stronger, more entrenched. He had already taken everything from Wisdom once. This time, Wisdom would be the one taking back control. "All right," Wisdom said, his voice steady. "We do it your way. But we do it fast. We don't have the luxury of time." Maxwell gave a sharp nod. "Agreed. I'll mobilize our team. We'll move tonight. I'll get you patched up as best I can, but you need to be ready. This is going to be a high-risk operation. You have to be prepared for anything." Wisdom glanced down at his side. The wound was still tender, but it wasn't life-threatening. He could manage. He'd been through worse. This wasn't about his body. It was about his mind, his determination. He couldn't afford to falter now. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Maxwell's team set to work, gathering their gear, running through the details of the operation. They were a small but efficient unit, precise, professional, and relentless. They knew what was at stake. For Wisdom, this wasn't just about stopping Roland anymore. This was personal. This was about redemption. When the time finally came, Wisdom's resolve was ironclad. The night was quiet as they made their way to the warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the cold air biting at their skin. Wisdom's heart pounded in his chest, his mind laser-focused on the mission ahead. Every step felt heavy with the weight of his past, the betrayal, the losses, the pain. But there was no turning back now. They reached the warehouse, a dilapidated building tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city. It was poorly lit, but the guards posted outside were alert, moving in a well-practiced rhythm. Wisdom could see it clearly. Roland had taken every precaution to protect what was his. But what Roland didn't know was that they were coming for him. They were coming to take back control. Maxwell signaled to his men, and they moved into position. Silence reigned as they approached the building, moving like shadows, their steps calculated and deliberate. Wisdom's breath was steady as he followed behind them, his hand instinctively resting on the gun at his side. This was it. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. They reached the entrance, and with a single, swift motion, Maxwell's team took out the guards. There was no time for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. They moved inside. The warehouse was dark, the air heavy with dust and the scent of neglect. But in the far corner, a faint light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. And there, bound to a chair, was the woman they had come for, Darnell's sister. Her face was bruised, her eyes wide with fear, but when she saw them, something flickered in her gaze. "Hope, are you here to help me?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. Wisdom stepped forward, his heart racing. "We're here to get you out," he said softly, reaching to untie the ropes that bound her. As the ropes fell away, the weight of the task ahead seemed to grow heavier. They had Darnell's sister. Now, they had to use her to break him. And once they did, they would go after Roland. No more games. No more waiting. The quiet hum of the warehouse felt suffocating as Wisdom stood over Darnell's sister. Her face, though bruised and battered, held a flicker of hope, something they hadn't seen in her eyes when they first found her, tied to that chair. As her ropes fell away, she rubbed her wrists, wincing in pain. But her gaze never left Wisdom, as if waiting for him to confirm that this wasn't some cruel trick. "We're here to help you," Wisdom said again, his voice low but firm. "We're not with Roland. We're here to get you out and put an end to this. But we need your help. We need to get to Darnell." Her eyes widened slightly, the gravity of his words sinking in. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "Darnell," she trailed off, her expression turning pained. "He's always been so protective of me. I know he'd do anything to keep me safe. But Roland's holding something over him. I don't think he can escape." Wisdom took a step closer, kneeling down in front of her. "We can't just wait for him to come to us. We need to get him to see that Roland's grip is slipping. If we can make him realize that he doesn't need to protect you anymore, he'll turn on Roland. He's the key to getting inside Roland's operation." She shook her head slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can convince him. Roland has so much power over him. He's done awful things to make sure Darnell stays loyal. Things I don't even know about." Wisdom's heart tightened at the thought of Darnell being trapped in that kind of life. But there was no room for doubt now. They had to act. Roland's empire was crumbling, and the cracks were showing. Darnell's loyalty could be the tipping point they needed. Maxwell stepped forward, his sharp eyes taking in the situation. We don't have time for uncertainty. We need to move quickly. If Roland finds out she's gone, he'll double down on Darnell, and we'll lose our chance. Wisdom nodded. You're right. We need to act before Roland figures it out. He turned back to the woman. Do you have any idea where Darnell might be right now? She hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her words carefully. Finally, she spoke. Roland has a private facility outside the city. It's where he keeps his most trusted men, and where he does business. Darnell's been there a lot lately. He thinks it's a way to prove his loyalty. A private facility. Wisdom felt a jolt of realization. This was it, the heart of Roland's operation. If they could infiltrate it and get to Darnell, they could take down everything Roland had worked so hard to build. But it would be dangerous. They were walking into the lion's den. We'll need to move fast, Maxwell said, pulling out a map. This facility is well guarded. We'll need to have a plan in place to get in and out without alerting anyone. I'll arrange for a team to hit the perimeter while we go in. Wisdom nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. Every step had to be calculated. Every movement had to be precise. One mistake could cost them everything. He couldn't afford to fail again. Get her to safety, Wisdom said to Maxwell, who nodded in agreement. We'll head to the facility. I'll get Darnell out, and we'll make sure he knows that he's not alone. Maxwell's men quickly escorted the woman out of the warehouse, ensuring that she was hidden away in a safe location. Meanwhile, Wisdom and his team prepared for what was to come. He could feel the weight of the mission on his shoulders. The stakes had never been higher. Not only was Darnell's life in their hands, but the fate of everything Wisdom had worked for hung in the balance. As they geared up and loaded into the vehicles, the tension in the air was palpable. Each man was silently aware of the danger that lay ahead, but they had no choice but to push forward. This was the final confrontation, the one that would either destroy them or secure their victory. The drive to Roland's facility was tense. The city's lights faded as they left the urban sprawl behind and entered the more isolated outskirts. Wisdom's mind flashed to the life he had lost, his wealth, his status, his family. But now wasn't the time to dwell on what was gone. The only thing that mattered was the fight ahead. As they approached the facility, it became clear how formidable it was. The building was a fortress, tall walls, heavily guarded, and fortified gates. But that was the point. They couldn't storm the gates. They needed to get inside undetected. Wisdom turned to Maxwell, his voice low but urgent. We need to disable the security system before we do anything. No alarms. No surveillance. Maxwell nodded, signaling to his team. We've got it covered. The team moved swiftly, quietly, no wasted movements. Maxwell's men infiltrated the perimeter, taking out guards silently and disabling the security cameras one by one. The minutes stretched on, each passing second adding to the pressure of the moment. Finally, Maxwell radioed in. We're in, he said. The system's down. You have a window to get inside. Wisdom took a deep breath, nodding to his team. This was it. They were in. But now, the real challenge would begin. The group moved toward the main building, their steps light but purposeful. The air was thick with anticipation, every sense heightened. They had no idea how much time they had before Roland discovered the breach. But Wisdom knew one thing for sure. They couldn't afford to waste any. As they reached the main entrance, Maxwell signaled for them to stop. He motioned toward a set of stairs leading down into the facility's depths, presumably where Roland's most trusted men were stationed. It was there they would find Darnell. Wisdom's heart pounded in his chest as they descended the stairs, moving with the precision of a well-trained unit. The facility's interior was even more intimidating than its exterior. Concrete walls, steel doors, and dim lighting. It was clear that Roland had spared no expense to protect what he considered his most valuable assets. They reached the bottom floor, where they encountered a small group of armed guards. Without hesitation, Maxwell's team took them out with deadly precision. Wisdom's mind was focused, every action deliberate. They couldn't afford a single mistake. At the far end of the room, behind a set of reinforced doors, Wisdom saw a figure, tall, broad-shouldered. It was Darnell. But he wasn't alone. A group of Roland's men surrounded him, their eyes fixed on the man who had once been their ally. But now, Darnell looked different, broken, worn down by the pressure of his loyalties. Wisdom stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Darnell, it's time to make a choice." The room fell silent as Darnell's eyes slowly lifted to meet Wisdom's. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a sharp exhale, he stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Do it," he said, his voice strained. "I've lost everything already, but I can't keep protecting her. I can't keep doing this. You want me to help you? You've got it." Wisdom felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by the urgency of the situation. Roland wouldn't take kindly to the defection of his most trusted men. They were running out of time. "Get him out of here," Maxwell ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "We need to move now." As they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Roland's voice, loud, commanding, and furious, shattered the silence. "You think you can take what's mine?" Roland snarled from the doorway, his men flanking him. It was the moment Wisdom had been dreading. The fight was far from over. The air inside the facility felt electric, thick with tension. Roland's voice echoed down the dim corridor, a chilling reminder of the power he held. His arrival was no surprise. Wisdom had known that time was running out, but hearing him speak, seeing the fury in his eyes, made it all the more real. This was the moment where everything could unravel, where everything could finally come together. Maxwell didn't hesitate. He signaled to his men to take positions, and they quickly moved into defensive formations, weapons ready. The sudden rush of adrenaline made the room feel smaller, as if the walls were closing in around them. Wisdom's eyes locked with Darnell's, who was standing a few feet away, his expression haunted, torn between the life he had known and the future he was being offered. Roland's silhouette emerged from the shadows, flanked by his most loyal men. His presence was like a storm gathering force, intense, commanding, unyielding. Well, Roland's voice dripped with contempt as he surveyed the room. "It seems my most trusted have turned against me. Darnell, you've disappointed me." He looked at Wisdom, his gaze cold. "And you. I should have known. You never stay down for long, do you, Wisdom? After everything I did to break you, you still think you can win?" Wisdom's grip on his weapon tightened. There was no turning back now. They had come this far, and Roland was standing in their way. His words were like poison, meant to make them second-guess everything they had fought for. But Wisdom knew better. The time for doubt was over. It was time to end this. Roland's eyes flicked to Darnell, his expression twisting in disgust. "You're weak," Roland sneered. "You always were. A man who betrays his own blood isn't fit to be part of anything. You're nothing without me." Darnell's hands clenched at his sides, his muscles taut with anger. But instead of responding, he simply stepped forward, aligning himself with Wisdom's team. His eyes were hard now, resolute. The damage Roland had done to him was deep, but Darnell had made his choice. "You've got it all wrong, Roland," Darnell said, his voice low but full of determination. "I'm not weak. You just never understood what it means to be free. You thought you could control everyone, manipulate them into doing your bidding. But you're wrong." Roland's face twisted in fury. "Enough of this nonsense." He motioned to his men. "Kill them all." In an instant, chaos erupted. Gunfire rang out, deafening in the small space as Wisdom and Maxwell's team fired back with deadly precision. The sharp crack of gunshots was followed by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor, but Roland's men were relentless, determined to protect their leader at any cost. Maxwell led the charge, moving like a shadow through the melee, directing his team to take out the remaining guards while Wisdom stayed focused on Roland. The two locked eyes, and for a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade away. It was just them, standing across from each other in the center of this battle. A man who had everything, and a man who had lost it all. Wisdom's chest tightened as the weight of the moment settled in. "You were never in control, Roland," Wisdom said, his voice steady despite the mayhem around them. "You never had the power you thought you did. You only ever had fear. And now, it's your turn to fear me." Roland's eyes narrowed, a sneer curling at the corners of his lips. "You really think you can defeat me?" I built this empire. You're nothing but a broken man clinging to delusions of grandeur. But wisdom wasn't listening anymore. He had heard it all before. Roland's threats, his arrogance, his need to dominate. This was about more than just taking Roland down. It was about reclaiming everything that had been stolen from him. His life, his dignity, his future. And he was ready to do whatever it took. The battle raged on around them, but wisdom's focus remained fixed on Roland. He moved quickly, ducking behind cover as Roland's men returned fire, but his mind was already racing. He knew that if they could just get close enough to Roland, they could end this. He had to take down the man who had ruined so many lives, who had betrayed so many. Maxwell's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. Wisdom, now's your chance. Take him out. With a surge of adrenaline, Wisdom bolted from his cover, sprinting toward Roland, his heart pounding in his chest. The gunfire from Roland's men intensified, but he was focused only on one thing: getting to Roland. The two men collided in the center of the room, the sound of their struggle drowned out by the chaos around them. Roland's grip was strong, but Wisdom had the advantage of rage. He fought like a man who had nothing left to lose, his movements fueled by a need for revenge, for justice. You think you can beat me? Roland spat, his face twisted in fury. I own this city. You're nothing. Wisdom's fist connected with Roland's jaw, knocking him back a few steps. The taste of victory was so close, but Wisdom knew better than to let his guard down. Roland was a fighter, ruthless and quick. He wouldn't go down easily. They grappled for control, each struggling to gain the upper hand. Roland reached for his gun, but Wisdom was quicker. He knocked it from Roland's hand, sending it skidding across the floor. A final, powerful punch from Wisdom sent Roland sprawling to the ground. The room fell into an eerie silence as Roland lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes wild with disbelief. He had lost. He had finally been bested. You're finished, Wisdom said, his voice low and cold. Your empire ends tonight. Roland struggled to rise, but Wisdom placed his boot on Roland's chest, pinning him to the floor. It was over. Wisdom had reclaimed his power. He had taken everything back: his life, his dignity, and his future. Maxwell approached, breathing heavily but with a look of satisfaction on his face. It's done. The city is ours. But Wisdom didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on Roland, who was now helpless beneath his foot. The man who had once been so powerful, so invincible, was nothing now. He had been brought low by the very people he had sought to control. You should have known, Wisdom muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Power isn't just about fear. It's about respect. And you never had that. Roland's eyes flickered with a mix of anger and fear, but there was no more fight left in him. Wisdom could see it now. The man was broken. The empire was no more. And as Wisdom stood over him, he realized that this victory wasn't just about taking Roland down. It was about something deeper. It was about reclaiming his own soul, his own life, and his own future. He had survived. And now, he would thrive. But the battle wasn't over. There were still loose ends to tie up, still pieces to move. And Wisdom knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. And as the final remnants of Roland's empire crumbled around him, Wisdom stepped into the future, knowing that this was just the beginning. The aftermath of the battle was surreal. The dust settled, the sound of gunfire slowly dying away, leaving only the ringing silence in the air. Roland's men had either fled or been taken down, and his empire, the fortress he had built over years of deceit and manipulation, was now crumbling. It felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted off Wisdom's shoulders, but at the same time, a deep sense of loss settled in his chest. For all the power he had regained, there was no joy in seeing the destruction of Roland. It was the end of a chapter in his life, but it was also a beginning. Maxwell stepped forward, his usual sharpness giving way to a moment of reflection. It's over. We've won. Wisdom didn't reply immediately. He was staring down at Roland, who was now kneeling on the cold concrete floor, utterly defeated. Roland's face was bloodied, his eyes wide with disbelief, as though he couldn't comprehend the turn of events. The man who had once been so untouchable was now broken, his empire reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. Wisdom's mind raced. It wasn't just the fact that Roland was done. It was the realization that this city, the life he had once been a part of, was now a different place. What Roland had built was a system of fear, of control. And though wisdom had destroyed that system, the remnants of it were still present in the people, in the streets, in the minds of those who had been under Roland's thumb. Is it really over? Wisdom murmured, more to himself than anyone else. What happens now? Maxwell paused before answering. We rebuild. You rebuild. People like Roland, they'll always leave a mark on the city, but they also leave room for something better. We can create something new, something fairer. Wisdom looked up at him. His expression hardened. He wasn't sure if he believed that. The world they had just walked away from had been ruthless, and while the fall of Roland was a victory, it was clear that the battle for a better city would not be easy. The scars left by men like Roland were deep. He couldn't just forget the years of manipulation and control that had shaped the lives of so many. And while Maxwell spoke of rebuilding, Wisdom knew that the work was far from finished. You're right about one thing, Wisdom said slowly, his gaze never leaving Roland. But I'm not sure I'm the man to rebuild anything. I've lost too much. Too many people have suffered because of me. Maxwell gave him a sharp look, a silent understanding passing between them. Maybe, but you've also gained something, Wisdom. You've regained your integrity, your strength. That's something many people never have the chance to do. Darnell, who had been standing off to the side, his face still uncertain, stepped forward. He's right. We all make mistakes, but you can make up for them. You've already done more than most could ever hope to do. Roland's gone, and now we can make sure nothing like this happens again. For the first time in what felt like years, Wisdom felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this. He had people who understood, people who believed in him, and more importantly, people who were willing to fight for something better. The city still had its darkness, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could be reshaped into something new. Maxwell, sensing the shift in Wisdom's mindset, nodded. We'll help you, Wisdom. We've got the resources, the men, and the willpower. We can bring this city back to life. But it won't happen overnight. You know that. Wisdom exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. I don't expect it to be easy, but I'm ready. And I'm not doing this alone. As the group took a moment to regroup, Maxwell began organizing his team to clean up the aftermath. It was clear they still had a lot of work ahead of them. Roland's influence had been widespread, and it wouldn't disappear in an instant. But the first step had been taken. The poison that had infected the city was slowly being eradicated. As the team moved to secure the building and gather any valuable intelligence, Wisdom stayed behind for a moment. He looked at Roland one last time, his thoughts a tangled web of conflicting emotions. The man at his feet had once been the symbol of wealth, power, and control. But now, he was nothing. A broken shell of what he had been. You had your chance, Wisdom said quietly to Roland, his voice cold and final. Now, it's over, and you'll never hurt anyone again. Roland, still kneeling, sneered at Wisdom, the fire of defiance burning weakly in his eyes. You think this is over? You think you've won? You're nothing but a fool. There are always more like me. Always more to take my place. Wisdom's lips curled into a grim smile. Let them try. But they won't have the same power you did. Not anymore. Without another word, Wisdom turned away from Roland, walking toward the exit. The battle was won. But the war, if you could even call it that, was just beginning. The city was in ruins, but there was a chance to rebuild, to create something better for those who had been forgotten, for those who had suffered. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he could feel the weight of the city on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, he also felt the stirring of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, and he didn't know what the future held. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't alone. Maxwell, Darnell, and the others had proven that they were committed to seeing this through. And together, they could change the city. They could reclaim the streets from the fear that had ruled them for so long. Wisdom wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was certain. The city was no longer Roland's. It was theirs. And as long as they fought for what was right, they had a chance to make it a better place. The city was quiet in the aftermath, but there was a stillness that carried with it the promise of change. It was as though the very air had shifted, the oppressive weight of Roland's empire no longer pressing down on its streets. The night felt different, as if the stars themselves were watching over the people below, waiting for something new to emerge. Wisdom stood outside the facility, the cool breeze rustling through his hair, his hands clenched in his pockets. He looked at the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the darkness. The city's silhouette stood tall against the rising sun, the shape of its future yet to be determined. The streets that had once been filled with corruption, greed, and fear were now empty, waiting to be repopulated with something else. "We've done it," Darnell said, his voice cutting through Wisdom's thoughts. He had come to stand next to him, his presence solid and reassuring. "But this is just the beginning, right?" Wisdom nodded, his gaze still fixed on the city. "Yes, Roland's gone, but the damage he did, it's deep. It's not just about taking him down. It's about rebuilding trust, restoring hope. It's about showing people that they don't have to live in fear anymore." Darnell glanced at him, sensing the weight of Wisdom's words. "I know it's not going to be easy, but you're the man to lead this. You've already proven you can do it. Look at what we've accomplished tonight." Wisdom's face was unreadable as he took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He appreciated Darnell's words, but he knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Rebuilding wasn't just about putting together broken pieces. It was about healing the wounds that ran deep through the city and its people. Maxwell arrived, his face still streaked with dust from the battle, but his eyes held a certain fire. He was a man of action, a man who thrived in moments like these. "The building's secure. We've got everything we need from Roland's archives. We'll be able to piece together the full extent of his operation. There's still a lot of work ahead, but I'm confident we can take down the rest of his network." Wisdom turned to face Maxwell, his mind already running through the details. "What's the plan?" Maxwell's eyes narrowed with determination. "We've got several key players from Roland's circle still out there. Some of them are already trying to regroup, but they won't be able to do much without Roland's backing. We need to act fast, cut the remaining pieces out of the system before they can rebuild. We can't give them the chance to regain control." Wisdom's lips tightened. "What about the people, those who were working for Roland? We need to make sure they're not left in the dark." Maxwell's expression softened slightly. "We'll need to offer them a way out. Some of them were just doing what they had to survive. We can't let them fall into the same trap Roland set. We offer them a choice, help us, or face justice. It's the only way." Wisdom nodded slowly, taking in Maxwell's words. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Many of Roland's former allies were ruthless and wouldn't give up their power without a fight. But Wisdom was determined. He wouldn't let the cycle of fear and control repeat itself. The people of the city deserved better. Darnell stepped forward again, his voice steady. "We've got your back, Wisdom. All of us. We fought together tonight, and we'll keep fighting. But you're the one who knows this city, the one who understands how it ticks. You're the one who can lead us through this." Wisdom met his brother's gaze, seeing the trust in his eyes. It meant more than he could put into words. For so long, he had felt isolated, disconnected from everyone, even from Darnell. But now, they stood together, side by side, ready to face the future. "I won't let you down," Wisdom said quietly. "I won't let this city fall back into the hands of men like Roland. This time, we do it right. We rebuild from the ground up." Maxwell clapped Wisdom on the back, a grin tugging at his lips. "That's the spirit. We've got the knowledge, the manpower, and the resources. Together, we can reshape this city. We can make it something it's never been before." And with that, the team moved into action. The first step was to dismantle Roland's network, taking down those who still sought to hold on to the old ways. The next was to restore order, to bring the people who had been forgotten back into the fold. But as they moved forward, there was one thing Wisdom knew for sure. The city's future was in his hands now. As the team worked through the night, gathering intel and preparing for the final push against the remnants of Roland's influence, Wisdom found himself walking the streets alone for a while, lost in thought. He had a lot of decisions to make. There were people to protect, lives to rebuild, and countless obstacles ahead. But this time, he wasn't doing it alone. The sun had fully risen now, casting a golden light over the city. It was a new day, and for the first time in a long while, Wisdom felt like he was standing on solid ground. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and planning. With Roland's empire crumbling, Wisdom and his team focused on dismantling the remaining pieces of his operation. They pored over the files they had seized from Roland's hideout, documents detailing illegal activities, bribery, and other crimes that had stained the city for years. Every file was a thread to pull. Every lead a potential piece of the puzzle that would bring down the rest of Roland's network. But it wasn't just about power plays and strategy anymore. Wisdom knew the real work was just beginning. The city had suffered under Roland's reign for too long, and the people had lost faith in the system. They needed hope, and that would take time to rebuild. One morning, as Wisdom was meeting with Maxwell in the newly secured base of operations, Darnell arrived with a stack of documents in his hands. His face was tense, the weight of the news he was carrying clear in his expression. "I've been talking to some of the city's leaders," Darnell said, laying the papers down on the table. "There's a lot of fear about what's going to happen next. People want answers, but they're also scared. They don't know if the power vacuum will just be filled by someone else who'll do the same things Roland did. We need a plan to rebuild trust." Wisdom studied the documents. There were notes from local government officials, business leaders, and community organizations, all expressing a mix of hope and uncertainty. They all wanted change, but they didn't believe it was possible. "We need to show them that things can be different," Wisdom said, rubbing his temples. "We can't just go after Roland's people and hope everything falls into place. If we want to rebuild this city, we need to make people believe that things can change, that they can be a part of it." Maxwell leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You're right. The people are key. We can't win this just through brute force. We need to start from the bottom, from the ground up. If we want to rebuild, we need to engage with the communities, with the workers, with the families who've been suffering for so long." Wisdom nodded slowly. This was the hardest part. He could go after Roland's old associates, take down the remnants of his empire, but that would only change the surface. The people needed to feel the change in their lives. They needed to see that their voices mattered, that their well-being was a priority. "We need to start with the neighborhoods," Wisdom said, his mind already racing with ideas. "We'll meet with the community leaders. We'll listen to their concerns and come up with a plan to make real changes. We'll restore safety, provide resources, and ensure that the businesses and workers who've been oppressed under Roland's thumb can thrive." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about real change, not just a band-aid fix. You think they'll trust us after everything?" Wisdom paused, considering. "It's not going to be easy. Trust doesn't come overnight. But we've got a chance here. We've got something Roland never had, the people support. If we can show them that we're different, that we care, then we can start rebuilding trust, piece by piece." Maxwell gave a short nod, impressed. "I like it. Let's set up meetings with the leaders. Start small, get feedback, and build from there. It won't be easy, but it's the only way." As the meeting ended, Wisdom found himself standing at the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. He could see the streets bustling with life, people going about their daily routines. It was the same city, but everything felt different now. Roland's grip was no longer there, and the future was uncertain. But for the first time, there was hope. Later that day, Wisdom and his team set out on their mission to meet with the community leaders. They visited local schools, neighborhood councils, and small businesses, asking questions and listening to the concerns of the people. Wisdom's reputation, as the man who had taken down Roland, opened doors. But it was his sincerity, his willingness to listen and learn, that began to win over hearts and minds. At first, the reception was cautious. People had been burned by promises before, and they weren't eager to trust again. But as Wisdom and his team continued to engage with the communities, things began to change. Slowly, the people started to open up. They spoke of their struggles, of living in fear, of watching their families suffer, of the endless corruption that had stained every part of their lives. One evening, after a particularly moving meeting with a local women's group, Wisdom stood outside the community center, his mind turning over everything he had heard. He felt the weight of the people's pain, their anger, and their desire for change. But there was something else too, a flicker of hope. They were tired, yes, but they weren't defeated. They still believed that things could get better. Darnell approached, his hands in his pockets, his expression contemplative. "How's it going?" Wisdom exhaled, glancing at Darnell. "Better than I expected. They're scared, but they're willing to trust us. It's going to take time, but we can make a difference." Darnell nodded. "We've already got some plans in motion. The people want safety, opportunities, education. They want something to believe in." Wisdom turned to face him, determination in his eyes. "We give them that. Not promises, but real action. We make sure they feel the change, every day. We'll rebuild the city, not just with policies, but with people. We make them a part of it." As the days turned into weeks, the momentum began to shift. More people joined the movement. Businesses that had been too afraid to speak out under Roland's rule now found themselves rallying behind Wisdom and his team. Local leaders who had been silenced by fear now had the courage to stand up and fight for what was right. There were still battles ahead, no doubt. Roland's former allies weren't going down without a fight, and there were still pockets of resistance scattered throughout the city. But for the first time in years, the people were starting to believe that they had a voice, that their future wasn't determined by the whims of men like Roland. Maxwell kept pushing forward with the dismantling of Roland's criminal network. The remaining operatives and corrupt officials were being rounded up, one by one. It was a long process, but it was working. The city was slowly being freed from the chains that had held it captive for so long. Wisdom didn't sleep much these days. There were too many people depending on him, too many decisions to make. But even in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself a breath, he could feel the pulse of something new in the city. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The winds of change were blowing, and they were carrying with them the hope of a new future. A future that belonged not to Roland, or to any one person, but to the people of the city. And Wisdom, finally free of the chains that had bound him for so long, was ready to lead them into that future. The weeks turned into months, and the winds of change continued to sweep across the city. Wisdom could feel the difference in the air now. People were starting to smile again. They were beginning to believe that things could get better. The first community programs were launched, the streets began to feel safer, and even the smallest businesses began to flourish as the oppressive weight of Roland's empire lifted. But with the progress came challenges. Rebuilding a city was not a task for the faint-hearted, and the deeper Wisdom went into the city's underbelly, the more he realized just how deep the roots of corruption went. Roland was just the tip of the iceberg. There were still corrupt officials, shady businessmen, and criminal syndicates that had been operating for years under the guise of legitimacy. They weren't going to disappear quietly. Maxwell, as always, was relentless in his pursuit of those still clinging to the old ways. But even he admitted that it was like chasing shadows. Every time they took down one corrupt figure, two more seemed to pop up in their place. "Every victory feels like a battle won," Maxwell said one evening as he and Wisdom sat across from each other, surrounded by maps, documents, and city blueprints. "But it's like we're fighting a hydra. We cut off one head, and two more take its place." Wisdom frowned, rubbing his chin. "I know. It's frustrating. But we can't afford to give up now. We're making progress. The people are starting to believe in us, in what we're doing. We can't let the old system win by default." Darnell, who had been listening from the side, added his thoughts. "But the people are scared, Wisdom. They've been living under oppression for so long that they're not used to freedom. Some are still hesitant to trust us, and the ones who do believe in us are afraid to act because they don't know what will happen next. How do we convince them to step forward?" Wisdom leaned back in his chair, looking out the window. He had always been someone who lived in the moment, but this was different. He wasn't just leading a group of people now. He was leading an entire city, a city that had been torn apart by greed and corruption. The path forward had no clear map. "We'll show them," Wisdom said after a long pause. "We'll show them that this isn't just about us fighting for change. It's about them fighting for their future." They need to feel like they're part of something bigger. They need to understand that every action they take, every voice they raise, counts. Maxwell nodded. We need to make the people part of the solution. They're tired of waiting for someone else to fix things for them. They want to be active participants in their own futures. Darnell looked concerned. And we'll have the support to make that happen? Wisdom thought for a moment. If we make them believe in the cause, we'll have their support. But we have to be careful. The old guard is still out there, waiting for us to slip up. If we give them even the slightest opening, we could lose everything. There was a moment of silence as the weight of his words settled over the group. They all knew the stakes, and they knew that the road ahead was fraught with dangers. Some expected, some not. Roland may have fallen, but his influence had created a deep divide that couldn't be erased overnight. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. That evening, as the city buzzed with its usual energy, Wisdom found himself walking alone through the streets. He needed time to think, to process everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, an unsettling sense that they were missing something critical, something they hadn't yet figured out. As he passed by the familiar landmarks, he could see the changes, the small victories, the new life in the city. But in the back of his mind, he knew it wasn't enough. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from Belinda. He hadn't heard from her in months, not since she'd left him in the wake of his fall from grace. The message was simple. We need to talk. Wisdom's heart sank. After everything that had happened, after all the work he had put into rebuilding the city, he hadn't expected to hear from Belinda again. He hadn't expected anything from her. But the message stirred something deep within him, a reminder of the pain he had felt when she abandoned him. It was a wound that had never fully healed, and now, it seemed, it was being reopened. He quickly dialed her number, feeling a mix of emotions. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before she answered. Hello. Belinda's voice was colder than he remembered. Belinda, what's going on? Wisdom asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Why now? There was a pause on the other end of the line before she spoke again, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I've heard things about what you're doing in this city. I need to know if it's true. Are you really trying to change everything? Wisdom's mind raced. Yes, I am. I'm trying to make this city a better place. I'm trying to fix what was broken. What do you mean, heard things? Belinda's voice softened, but there was still an edge to it. I've seen the news. The arrests, the programs, the rebuilding. People are talking about you, Wisdom. They're saying you're not just taking down criminals, you're building something new, something powerful. Wisdom's pulse quickened. I'm doing what needs to be done, Belinda. I'm not looking for power. I'm doing this for the people, for the city. There was silence for a moment, then Belinda spoke again, her voice almost a whisper. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know I can't stay away forever. Wisdom felt a twinge of anger mixed with something else, something he didn't want to acknowledge. You left me when I needed you most. You didn't believe in me. You turned your back on me. Belinda sighed, a soft sound that carried with it years of regret. I was scared, Wisdom. I was scared of losing everything. But now, I see what you're doing. And I don't know if it's too late for me to come back. Wisdom took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I don't know what you expect from me, but I'm not the same man I was before. And I'm not going to put the city's future in jeopardy for anyone. There was another long pause, and for a moment, Wisdom wasn't sure if she would respond. When she did, her voice was small. I know. I need to know if you can still trust me. Wisdom's heart clenched. The city was changing, and with it, everything around him. The past was still a shadow over his future, and Belinda was a part of that past. A part he wasn't sure he could revisit. I don't know, he said finally, his voice low. But I do know that the city needs me now. It needs all of us. As the line went silent again, Wisdom felt a sense of finality. The world was shifting, and people were starting to step forward, some with hope and others with hesitation. The journey was far from over, and he could feel that the biggest challenges were still ahead. The future of the city, and his own future, was something he still couldn't fully grasp. But one thing was clear. Change was coming, and whether he was ready or not, he would have to face it head-on. The city was shifting beneath Wisdom's feet. It wasn't just the tangible changes, the streets cleaned, businesses reopening, schools being rebuilt, but something deeper, something more subtle. People were beginning to talk again, to trust again. But in that trust, something else stirred: fear. The whispers of Roland's former allies never stopped. They lurked in the shadows, their networks still intact, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't just the criminal syndicates that remained a threat. Even the political elite had their eyes on the power vacuum Wisdom was beginning to fill. They were watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. And then there was Belinda. The conversation they'd had on the phone lingered in Wisdom's mind for days. Could he really trust her again? She had left him when he was at his lowest, never once trying to stand by his side. But now, as the city began to change, so did her attitude. Was this her moment to return, to redeem herself? Or was she simply another player trying to leverage the shifting tides for her own benefit? That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Wisdom walked the streets once again, a constant reminder of how much had been lost and how much was still at stake. The city was alive with energy, children playing in the parks, neighbors chatting, and street vendors calling out to passers-by. But in the corner of his mind, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. His phone buzzed again. It was a text message from Maxwell. "We've got a lead. Roland's right-hand man, Victor, has resurfaced. We need to act fast." Wisdom's pulse quickened. Victor had been one of Roland's most trusted allies, a man whose influence had seeped into nearly every corner of the city. It was only a matter of time before he resurfaced, and if Wisdom wasn't careful, Victor could be the spark that reignited the old corrupt system. Wisdom immediately called Maxwell. "Where is he?" Wisdom asked, his tone sharp. Maxwell's voice crackled through the line. "We've tracked him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. We're assembling a team now, but this isn't going to be easy. Victor won't go down without a fight." Wisdom didn't hesitate. "I'll meet you there." The abandoned warehouse was just as desolate as the rest of the surrounding area, a once bustling industrial hub now left to rot. The windows were boarded up, and the metal doors were rusted with age. As Wisdom and his team approached the location, the air felt thick with anticipation. It was a trap, no doubt. Victor had always been a man who liked to control the narrative, and this would be no different. As they entered the warehouse, the silence was oppressive. Shadows stretched across the walls, creating an eerie atmosphere. Every footstep felt too loud, every creak of the floorboards too obvious. The team moved cautiously, weapons drawn, eyes scanning every corner. Then, they heard it. A voice, low and menacing. Well, Wisdom, the prodigal son returns," came a familiar voice from the darkness. Victor stepped out from the shadows, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips. He was tall, with a sharp, angular face that looked like it had been chiseled from stone. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Wisdom's with a knowing glint. "I must admit," Victor continued, his tone dripping with contempt, "I didn't expect you to last this long. After all, you were just a bank manager. How did you think you could take on someone like Roland?" Wisdom's grip tightened on his weapon, but he kept his voice steady. "I didn't take him on alone. I've got people behind me now. People who want change." Victor's laugh echoed off the walls, mocking. "Change? Don't be naive. You think the city will just roll over and accept your little revolution? I built this city's underbelly, and it's not going anywhere. You're just a temporary inconvenience, Wisdom. A fleeting moment of hope." Wisdom stepped forward, his voice firm. "No, I'm not a moment. I'm the future. And your reign ends tonight." Victor's expression darkened. "You'll regret this." Without warning, he reached for a hidden button on the wall, and the entire warehouse shifted. Hidden doors slid open, revealing armed men who had been lying in wait. The trap had been set, but Wisdom was ready. His team sprang into action, a well-oiled machine. Gunfire rang out, loud and chaotic, as the two sides collided. Wisdom dodged behind crates for cover, his heart pounding in his chest. Every movement was calculated, every decision crucial. This wasn't just about taking down Victor. It was about making sure the city stayed on the path they had set. Through the haze of gunfire, Wisdom spotted Victor moving toward the back of the warehouse, his expression twisted in fury. Wisdom knew this was his chance. "Maxwell," he shouted, motioning for his team to cover him. "I'm going after him." Maxwell nodded, his face grim. "Be careful. He's dangerous." Wisdom didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the back of the warehouse, his mind focused on one goal, Victor. As he rounded a corner, he found Victor standing by a door, a smug grin on his face. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Victor sneered, pulling out a gun from behind his back. "You've no idea what you're up against." Wisdom's hand moved quickly, his own weapon raised, and in an instant, he fired. Victor staggered back, his eyes wide in shock, before crumpling to the ground, his weapon falling from his grasp. Wisdom stood over him, panting heavily, his heart racing. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel triumphant. The reality of the situation was sinking in. This was only one piece of the puzzle, and there were many more pieces yet to be put in place. Victor groaned, trying to lift his head. "You may have won this round, Wisdom, but the city still belongs to us. The battle's not over. You're too weak." Wisdom looked down at him, his face hard. "I'm not weak. You were the weak one. You couldn't see the future because you were too busy holding on to the past." As Victor's breathing slowed, Wisdom turned and walked away. It wasn't victory that he sought, it was justice. And that meant more than just taking down one man. It meant securing the future for everyone in the city. As he exited the warehouse, Maxwell was waiting for him, a grim expression on his face. "We've got him," Maxwell said, his voice low. "But this won't be the last we hear from Roland's network. There are more players still out there." Wisdom nodded. He knew the battle wasn't over, but they had made significant progress. Victor was just a part of the larger picture, and as long as he was alive, the city was still in danger. "Keep pushing forward," Wisdom said, determination hardening his voice. "We'll rebuild, no matter what. We won't let the past control us anymore." But as he walked away from the warehouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching him from the shadows. The night after Victor's capture was restless. Wisdom couldn't escape the feeling that the victory, though hard-earned, was temporary. As he lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the city's future pressed heavily on him. The battle against corruption had started, yes, but the real war was far from over. As the first rays of morning light pierced through his window, he got up, dressed quickly, and headed straight to the headquarters. The team was already gathering, the energy in the air thick with anticipation. They had successfully detained Victor, but the underworld they were trying to dismantle was far larger than one man. Maxwell was pacing back and forth, clearly on edge. He looked up as Wisdom entered the room. "We've got more problems. Roland's network is still intact, and now we've stirred the hornet's nest. Someone's going to come after us. Wisdom, you're too much of a threat now." Wisdom nodded. "I know, but we're not going to let them take us down. Not after everything we've built." "You don't understand," Maxwell said, running a hand through his hair. "Victor was just a pawn. Roland's real power lies with the people we don't know about. The people in positions of authority, in business, in the government. They've been pulling the strings all along." The realization hit Wisdom like a freight train. He had been so focused on the immediate threat, on taking down Roland and his close allies, that he had neglected to see the far-reaching implications. The network wasn't just a collection of criminals. It was an intricate web that extended into every corner of the city. Politicians, judges, businessmen, they all had ties to Roland, and cutting off one head wouldn't be enough to defeat the beast. "What do we do now?" Wisdom asked, his voice low but determined. Maxwell paused, staring at the floor. "We need to expose them. All of them. The people still pulling the strings. But we need solid evidence, something irrefutable. Without it, they'll just disappear into the shadows, and it'll be like none of this ever happened." "We have to find it then," Wisdom said, his resolve hardening. "No more waiting. We go after the people who are still hiding." The team rallied around him, eager to take the fight to the next level. But Wisdom knew that things were about to get much more dangerous. The city's elite were not going to just lie down and accept defeat. If anything, they would fight harder, and their retaliation would be swift and brutal. Later that day, Wisdom called a meeting with Darnell, Maxwell, and the others. They needed to discuss their next move, but Wisdom's mind was still consumed with the uncertainty of what was coming. As the group settled in, he couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Everyone was on edge, knowing that they were stepping into a battle that could change everything. "Here's what we know," Maxwell said, sliding a set of documents across the table. "Victor's capture didn't come without consequences. There are already whispers of a larger syndicate that's been operating in the shadows. Roland might be gone, but his reach is still very much alive. And the people who were once his allies aren't going to let go of that power easily." Darnell tapped his fingers on the table, clearly worried. "We're going to need more than just evidence. We're going to need leverage. They're not going to just hand over everything without a fight. That's exactly why we need to expose them for what they really are," Wisdom said, his tone unwavering. "We show the city what's been happening behind the scenes. The corruption, the manipulation, the blood on their hands. Once the people know the truth, they won't have a choice but to take action." "But how do we get that truth?" Darnell asked. "The people we're dealing with don't leave a paper trail. They don't make mistakes." "We don't need mistakes," Wisdom replied, a dangerous glint in his eye. "We need connections. We need to dig deeper. If they think they can keep hiding in the shadows, they're wrong. We're going to shine a light on them, no matter how deep they've buried themselves." The room fell silent as the gravity of Wisdom's words settled in. Everyone knew what this meant. It meant going up against the city's most powerful people, those who controlled the flow of money, the flow of influence, and the very fabric of the city itself. It meant risking everything to expose the truth. Maxwell broke the silence. "We've been gathering intel on some of the top players. There's a politician named Thomas Alden. He's been under the radar for years, but we know he was heavily involved with Roland's empire. If we can get to him, we might be able to break the entire network open." Wisdom nodded. "Then we go after him. Find a way to make him crack." The group spent the next few hours going over the plan, refining their approach. The more they learned about Alden, the more dangerous their mission became. Alden was no fool. He had built his career on secrecy and manipulation. But Wisdom knew that no one was untouchable, not anymore. As the meeting adjourned, Wisdom stepped out into the night air, his mind racing. The city was on the brink of something monumental, but the storm was coming, and it would test everything they had fought for. Roland's downfall had been just the beginning, and if Wisdom was to succeed, he would need more than just a team. He would need the city's faith, its trust, and its unity. But as the night grew darker, Wisdom couldn't shake the feeling that something even more ominous was waiting for him. There was a shadow moving in the distance, just out of reach. A shadow that threatened to undo everything he had worked so hard for. The days following their plan to expose Thomas Alden were a blur of activity. Wisdom's team worked tirelessly, piecing together information, gathering evidence, and laying the groundwork for the final confrontation. But as they delved deeper into the city's underbelly, it became clear that the network of corruption ran far deeper than they had initially suspected. Alden was just the tip of the iceberg. Wisdom and his team had uncovered ties between Alden and a number of prominent business figures, judges, and law enforcement officers. These were people who had been complicit in the crimes that had plagued the city for years, people who had enriched themselves at the expense of the innocent. And the more Wisdom learned, the more dangerous his mission became. It was an early morning when the first sign of trouble appeared. Maxwell had just left a secure meeting when he received an encrypted message. He looked over his shoulder before unlocking his phone. The message was brief, but its implications were enough to send a chill down his spine. "You've gone too far. Step back now, or the consequences will be dire." Maxwell's mind raced. He immediately forwarded the message to Wisdom, adding a note of his own, "They're watching us. This is bigger than we thought." Wisdom stared at the message, his fingers tightening around his phone. He had suspected that this day would come, the day when the shadowy figures they were targeting would finally begin to fight back. But he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "We can't back down now," Wisdom muttered to himself. His gaze drifted to the papers and photos scattered on his desk, evidence of Alden's connections to the criminal empire Roland had once controlled. He had no choice but to keep pushing forward. Later that afternoon, Wisdom called a meeting with his core team. They gathered in their usual headquarters, a small, fortified building in the heart of the city. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them safe for now. The team was anxious, but they knew they had no time to waste. "We've made progress, but we've also made enemies," Wisdom began, his voice steady. "Alden's people are already aware of what we're doing. We need to move faster. The moment we expose him, we'll be facing more than just his legal team. We'll be up against an entire network of power, and they won't hesitate to destroy us." Maxwell spoke up, his face grim. "They've already started to move. We've intercepted more messages. They're tightening their grip on the city, and they know we're coming for them." Darnell slammed his fist onto the table. "We can't let them win. This is our chance to take down the entire system. We're not just fighting for the people. We're fighting for everything this city could be." Wisdom nodded. "Exactly. But we can't do it alone. We need allies. We need to make sure the people know what's really going on, so they'll stand with us when the time comes." The next few days were a blur of preparations. The team continued to gather evidence, but they also began reaching out to other groups within the city. Activists, journalists, even some politicians who were still on the fence. They needed to form a coalition, one that could stand up to the powerful figures they were about to expose. But even as they worked, the threat of retaliation loomed over them. They began receiving anonymous warnings, messages in the form of cryptic symbols, notes slipped under doors, and phone calls with heavy breathing on the other end. It was clear that Roland's network wasn't going to allow them to expose their secrets without a fight. Then, one night, as Wisdom was making his way home after a long day, the unthinkable happened. He had just turned down a quiet street near his apartment when a car came screeching around the corner. Before he could react, two masked men jumped out, pulling him into the back seat before he could even scream. The car sped off into the night, the city's lights blurring past him as he struggled to break free. But the men were too strong. They held him down, one of them pressing a cold, metal object against his chest. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long, Wisdom," one of the men said, his voice muffled by the mask. "It's time for you to disappear." Fear gripped Wisdom's heart. They had been expecting this. They had known that eventually, Roland's allies would try to silence him. But it didn't matter. He wouldn't go down without a fight. With a burst of adrenaline, Wisdom kicked out, knocking one of the men off balance. He pushed the other off him, using the momentum to open the door and tumble out of the moving vehicle. The world spun as he hit the pavement, rolling into the street. He didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The men in the car had slowed, but they weren't done yet. They turned around, the headlights catching Wisdom in their glare. In that moment, he realized how close he had come to dying. But he wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not when everything was so close. He darted into a nearby alleyway, weaving between the buildings. The sound of the car's tires screeching against the asphalt echoed in the distance. The men were still pursuing him, but Wisdom knew the city well. He had spent enough time here to understand its hidden paths and shortcuts. He sprinted through the maze of alleyways, his thoughts racing. The last thing he needed was to be caught now. He had too much left to do. But with each step, the weight of the danger pressing in on him became heavier. Roland's empire wasn't going to go down without a fight, and Wisdom had just made himself its prime target. After several minutes, Wisdom ducked into a small, dimly lit doorway. He paused, listening for the sound of the car, but all was quiet. His heart was still pounding, his body shaking with adrenaline. He had made it for now, but he knew the danger was far from over. As he caught his breath, he pulled out his phone and texted Maxwell. "We need to move fast. I've been targeted. They won't stop until we're all dead." Maxwell's reply came quickly. "We've got your back. Get to the safe house. We'll be ready." Wisdom couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only just beginning. They were in too deep now, and every move they made would bring them closer to the final confrontation. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. The city belonged to its people, and Wisdom would see it return to them, no matter the cost. The adrenaline still surged through Wisdom's body as he crouched in the darkened alley, his mind racing. The message from Maxwell had been clear. They had to move fast. The city's elite, now fully aware of the threat Wisdom posed, were taking no chances. Their retaliation had already begun, and Wisdom was now at the center of a deadly game with no room for error. He checked his surroundings one last time before slipping through the narrow gap in the alley that led to the back entrance of an old, run-down building. It wasn't much, just an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, but it was enough. The safe house, as they called it, was designed to keep them hidden, out of sight, and safe from those who would do them harm. As he entered the dimly lit space, Wisdom was greeted by the sight of Maxwell and Darnell, already waiting. The tension in the room was palpable, and Wisdom knew that time was running out. "You're lucky to be alive," Maxwell said, his voice low but edged with concern. "We heard what happened. They're coming for you, Wisdom. They won't stop." Wisdom nodded, still catching his breath. "I know. They made it clear tonight. This isn't just about Alden anymore. This is about all of us." Darnell, ever the optimist, tried to lift the mood. "But they don't know everything. We still have the upper hand. We've got the evidence, and we've got people who are willing to stand with us." "You're right," Wisdom said, his tone firming, "but it's not enough. Not yet. We need more. We need to show the city what these people are really capable of, what they've been hiding for years. But the moment we make our move, there's no going back." Maxwell paced back and forth, the weight of their mission settling on his shoulders. "What's the next step then? We've been digging into Alden's connections, but we're still missing the key piece. The final link that proves just how deep the corruption runs. We can't go public until we have it. Otherwise, they'll just bury us." Wisdom leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples. His mind raced through the possibilities. What were they missing? The pieces of the puzzle were all in place, but something felt off. They were so close, yet they were still operating in the dark. The city's power brokers were experts at hiding in plain sight, and Wisdom knew that any misstep could send them right back to square one. "There's one place we haven't touched yet," Wisdom said, his voice sharp. "Roland's old financial records. We've seen the surface, but we need to go deeper. We need to find the hidden accounts, the secret deals, the people who were bought and paid for." "Roland's finances are buried deep," Maxwell said. "You're talking about going after private records, international accounts. It's not just dangerous, it's near impossible." "I don't care how impossible it is," Wisdom said, his eyes burning with determination. "We've come too far to stop now. We find those records, and we find the names. We expose them all." The next few hours were a blur of action. The team worked together in silent synchronization, each member playing a crucial part in the operation. Darnell made calls to trusted contacts who had access to secure databases. Maxwell used his connections in the city's underworld to track down anyone who might have been involved in Roland's schemes. Wisdom, meanwhile, stayed focused, running through every possible angle in his mind. But as the night wore on, the pressure mounted. Every moment felt like they were being hunted, every sound in the street outside sounding like the approach of their enemies. The walls of the safe house seemed to close in around them as the clock ticked down. They knew that once they made their move, there would be no turning back. Then, just before dawn, they got the break they needed. Darnell walked in, his face lighting up with excitement. "I found it. The account. It's buried in a series of offshore holdings. It's all in the name of a shell company, one that was set up under the guise of a legitimate business. But we've traced it back to Alden's associates. It's all there. Transactions, bribes, the whole thing." Wisdom stood up, his heart pounding. "Where?" Darnell handed him a tablet, showing a series of encrypted files. "It's a mess, but with this, we've got a trail. A direct link between Alden, Roland, and the people they've been bribing." Maxwell leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the data. "This is it. This is the evidence we've been waiting for. If we release this to the public, it'll change everything," Wisdom finished for him, his voice steady. "But it also means the end of us if we don't do this right. They won't just sit back and let us ruin their empire." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled in. They had the evidence, the smoking gun. But now came the hardest part, getting it out to the people without getting caught in the process. Every second counted. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Maxwell broke the silence. "We have one shot at this. We leak the files, go public with the connections, and let the world see just how deep the rot runs. But we need to be prepared. They'll come after us, after all of us. Wisdom nodded. We've come this far. We can't stop now. Get the files to the media, and make sure they're locked in. Once we release this, it's over for them. The team spent the rest of the day preparing for the leak. The tension was unbearable as they coordinated with journalists, hacking into secure systems, and setting up a fail-safe plan in case things went wrong. They had only one chance to do this. If they messed up, it would mean disaster, not just for them, but for the entire city. As dusk fell and the city's lights flickered on, Wisdom stood at the window of the safe house, staring out at the skyline. He knew that the moment they released the files, everything would change. It would either be their victory or their doom. But he was ready. He had no choice. They had come too far to turn back. The city was unusually quiet as Wisdom sat in the dimly lit corner of the safe house. The weight of their decision pressed down on him like a lead blanket. On the table before him, the encrypted files glowed on the tablet screen. The culmination of months of risk, sacrifice, and relentless digging. The evidence was damning, implicating Alden and his allies in a web of corruption, so vast it could shatter the very foundation of the city. Wisdom's team had done the impossible. They had unearthed the secrets hidden beneath years of deception. But now, the real test lay ahead. Releasing the files and surviving the fallout. Maxwell entered the room, his expression grim but resolute. "It's all set," he said. "The files have been duplicated and sent to our trusted contacts in the media. They'll start publishing as soon as we give the word." Darnell followed behind him, carrying a bag filled with burner phones and other supplies. "We've also got the failsafe ready. If something happens to us, the files will auto-release to the public in waves. They won't be able to silence this, no matter what they try." Wisdom nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good. This is the moment we've been waiting for. Once we do this, there's no going back. They'll come for us, but we'll be ready." The team gathered around the table, their faces illuminated by the glow of the tablet. Each of them knew the stakes. Each of them understood the risks. But none of them hesitated. Maxwell glanced at Wisdom. "Are you sure about this? Once the files go live, we become targets. They'll stop at nothing to take us down." Wisdom met his gaze, his voice steady. "We've come too far to stop now. The people deserve to know the truth. It's time to finish what we started." With a deep breath, he tapped the screen, initiating the upload. The files began to transfer, their encrypted content streaming to media outlets, whistleblower platforms, and trusted allies. Within minutes, the first wave of leaks would hit the airwaves, exposing the rot at the core of the city's power structure. As they waited, the tension in the room was palpable. Every sound outside the safe house seemed amplified. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog. Wisdom knew it was only a matter of time before the retaliation began. The first wave. Less than an hour later, the first reports began to surface. News anchors appeared on television screens across the city, their expressions a mix of shock and determination as they revealed the depth of the corruption. Headlines blared the names of powerful figures tied to Roland's empire. Thomas Alden, prominent judges, high-ranking police officials, and influential business moguls. The leaked files were undeniable, their authenticity verified by independent experts. The city erupted in chaos. Social media platforms lit up with outrage as citizens demanded justice. Protests broke out in front of government buildings, fueled by years of frustration and anger. For the first time in decades, the people had proof of the corruption that had plagued their lives, and they were ready to fight back. Wisdom watched the coverage from the safe house, his heart pounding. He had expected a reaction, but the sheer scale of it was overwhelming. The city was waking up, and there was no turning back. Maxwell paced the room, his phone in hand. "We're getting reports of protests in at least 6 districts. The people are rising up, Wisdom. They're demanding answers." Darnell looked up from his laptop. "But so are Alden's allies. There's chatter on their networks. They're mobilizing, trying to shut this down before it gets any worse." Wisdom's eyes narrowed. "Let them try. The truth is out now. They can't silence the people." Retaliation. As the night wore on, the team's worst fears came true. The safe house was compromised. Maxwell's phone buzzed with an alert. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. We've got company. Surveillance cameras picked up unmarked vehicles circling the area. They know we're here. Darnell cursed under his breath, quickly packing up his equipment. We need to move. Now. Wisdom grabbed the tablet and the bag of supplies. Get everything. We can't leave anything behind. The team moved swiftly, exiting through a hidden passage that led to the back of the building. As they slipped into the shadows, the sound of approaching engines grew louder. The unmarked vehicles screeched to a halt in front of the safe house, and armed men poured out, their faces obscured by masks. From their vantage point, Wisdom and his team watched as the men stormed the building, searching for them. It was a chilling reminder of just how far Alden's network would go to protect itself. They're not going to stop, Maxwell said quietly. They'll hunt us down until there's nothing left. Wisdom's jaw tightened. Then we keep moving. We've done our part. Now it's up to the people to take the fight to them. The city awakens. By dawn, the city was unrecognizable. Protests had spread to every corner, fueled by the relentless media coverage of the leaked files. Citizens from all walks of life joined together, demanding justice and accountability. The streets were filled with chants, signs, and an unshakable sense of purpose. But the opposition was just as fierce. Alden's allies deployed their resources, using law enforcement and private security forces to suppress the protests. The city teetered on the brink of chaos, and the outcome was uncertain. Wisdom and his team stayed on the move, using safe houses and trusted contacts to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. Despite the danger, they remained committed to their mission. The fight was far from over, but they had lit a spark that could not be extinguished. As the sun rose over the city, Wisdom stood on the rooftop of their latest hideout, looking out over the skyline. He could hear the chants of the protesters in the distance, their voices rising like a chorus of hope. This is just the beginning, he said quietly, his resolve unshaken. They wanted to silence us, but they underestimated the power of the truth. The city belongs to the people now. Maxwell joined him on the rooftop, his expression weary but determined. What's next? Wisdom turned to him, a small smile on his face. We keep fighting, until they have no place left to hide. The morning sun barely warmed the city streets as Wisdom and his team made their way through a maze of back alleys, their breaths clouding in the chilly air. The tension was suffocating. Every shadow felt like it held danger, every sound like a harbinger of discovery. Their latest hideout had been compromised barely an hour after they left the safe house. The net was tightening, and their enemies were relentless. They're tracking us faster than we anticipated, Maxwell said, glancing over his shoulder as they ducked into an abandoned parking garage. His voice was taut with urgency. We need a better plan. Wisdom nodded, his mind racing. They're not just guessing. They're using advanced surveillance. Maybe a mole. We'll need to move farther out of the city to regroup. Darnell was already scanning his phone, checking for signals and patterns that could indicate they were being tracked. It's not just surveillance, he said grimly. They've deployed drones. I intercepted a feed. They're searching rooftops, alleyways, anywhere we might be hiding. Maxwell cursed under his breath. Alden's pulling out all the stops. He's desperate to bury us before this spirals out of control. Wisdom's eyes darkened. Then we stay ahead of him. But first, we need to cut off their ability to track us. Darnell, can you jam their surveillance? Darnell nodded. It's risky, but doable. I'll need a secure location to set it up, somewhere they won't expect us to be. Wisdom thought for a moment, then pointed to a crumbling industrial area on the edge of the city. The old shipping yards. No one's used them in years. It's risky, but it's our best shot. The old shipping yard. The team reached the shipping yard as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in hues of gold and crimson. The area was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. Massive shipping containers, stacked haphazardly, created a labyrinth of steel corridors. It was the perfect place to hide, if only for a while. This'll do, Darnell said, setting up his equipment inside one of the larger containers. Give me an hour, and I'll scramble their drones and comms. It'll buy us some time. Maxwell kept watch at the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the empty yard. We're cutting it close. They'll know something's up the moment their systems go dark. That's the point, Wisdom said, his voice steady. We want them to think we're vulnerable. It'll draw their attention while we plan our next move. Darnell worked quickly, his fingers flying over his keyboard. Sparks of determination lit his face, but Wisdom could see the exhaustion in his eyes. They were all running on fumes, but the stakes left no room for rest. The ambush. Just as Darnell finished his work, a low hum filled the air. The team froze. Maxwell's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon tucked under his jacket. They're here, he said grimly. Multiple vehicles, coming in fast. Wisdom's heart pounded as he peered out through a narrow gap in the container. Headlights pierced the darkness as unmarked SUVs rolled into the yard, their engines roaring like beasts in the night. Armed men spilled out, their movements calculated and precise. They must have tracked us anyway, Maxwell hissed. We need to move. No, Wisdom said, his mind racing. We can't keep running. We need to send a message. Darnell looked at him, his face pale. What are you saying? Wisdom's gaze hardened. We fight. The standoff. The team quickly positioned themselves among the shipping containers, using the maze-like layout to their advantage. Wisdom took a deep breath, his senses sharpening as he focused on the approaching men. He wasn't a soldier, but desperation and conviction had a way of turning anyone into a fighter. The first group of men moved cautiously through the yard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They were professionals, but they weren't prepared for the resistance they were about to face. Maxwell struck first. From his hidden vantage point, he took out one of the guards with a well-aimed blow, his movements swift and silent. The man crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling with a dull thud. The others quickly followed suit. Using the element of surprise, the team worked together to incapacitate as many of the guards as possible. But the enemy's numbers were overwhelming, and soon the firefight began in earnest. Bullets ricocheted off the metal containers, the deafening sound echoing through the yard. Wisdom ducked behind cover, his heart pounding as he returned fire with a weapon he'd taken from one of the guards. He wasn't a marksman, but his determination made up for his lack of skill. Darnell, how's that jamming device holding up? Wisdom shouted over the chaos. It's working. Darnell yelled back, his voice strained. But they've already called reinforcements. We're outnumbered. Wisdom gritted his teeth. They needed a way out, and fast. Escape. As the fight raged on, Wisdom spotted an opportunity. A large truck sat idling near the edge of the yard, its driver likely hiding from the chaos. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to escape. Maxwell, Wisdom called, pointing to the truck. We need to get to that vehicle. Maxwell nodded, his face set with determination. Cover me. Wisdom and Darnell provided suppressing fire as Maxwell sprinted toward the truck, his movements swift and precise. He reached the vehicle and climbed into the cab, motioning for the others to follow. Go! Wisdom shouted, covering Darnell as they made their way to the truck. Bullets whizzed past them, but somehow, they managed to reach the vehicle unscathed. Maxwell floored the gas pedal, the truck roaring to life as it barreled through the shipping yard. The armed men scrambled to stop them, but it was too late. The truck smashed through the gates, leaving the chaos behind. As they sped through the darkened streets, Wisdom leaned back, his chest heaving with exhaustion. They had survived, but just barely. The fight was far from over, but for now, they had bought themselves a little more time. We're not done yet, Wisdom said, his voice firm. They'll keep coming. But so will we. Maxwell glanced at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. Then let's make them regret it. The truck's engine roared as Maxwell weaved through the city's backstreets, the chaos of the ambush still echoing in Wisdom's ears. The night was alive with danger. Unmarked SUVs and drones prowled the city, hunting them like prey. Yet, as the adrenaline coursed through his veins, Wisdom's mind burned with clarity. It was no longer enough to survive. It was time to turn the tables. We can't keep running like this, Maxwell said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. They'll box us in eventually. Wisdom, seated beside him, nodded. We need to go on the offensive. If we wait for them to crush us, we lose everything. Darnell, nursing a graze on his arm, winced but managed a nod from the back seat. I'm with you. But what's the plan? We've blown up Alden's operation, but he's still standing and furious. Wisdom's gaze hardened as he pulled out a burner phone. We target Alden where it hurts most. His stronghold? His personal vault. It's where he keeps his most incriminating evidence, along with his assets. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. You're talking about hitting Alden's headquarters? The place is a fortress. It is, Wisdom admitted. But it's also the heart of his power. If we take it down, we cripple him. No more reinforcements. No more resources to throw at us. It's risky, but it's our best shot. As the truck screeched to a halt in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Wisdom immediately began making calls. The burner phone was linked to a secure network Darnell had set up months ago, and it connected Wisdom to a growing list of allies who had been quietly supporting their cause. Within an hour, a small but determined group of people arrived. They were journalists, whistleblowers, and ex-employees of Alden's corrupt empire. Each had their reasons for joining, and each carried a spark of defiance in their eyes. We've seen the files you leaked, said a woman named Clara, a former accountant for one of Alden's shell companies. He ruined lives for profit, and now it's time to ruin his. Another man, a mechanic named Otis, nodded grimly. Count me in. Alden's goons burned down my shop when I refused to pay their fees. Let's take this fight to him. Wisdom looked at the group, feeling a surge of hope. We'll need all the help we can get. This isn't just about taking down Alden. It's about giving this city back to its people. The plan was ambitious, but the group knew it had to be. Alden's headquarters, an imposing skyscraper in the city's financial district, was a fortress of glass and steel. Its security system was state-of-the-art, its guards well-trained and heavily armed. But Wisdom and his team had an edge: knowledge. Darnell had spent weeks hacking into Alden's systems, mapping out weaknesses in the security grid. Maxwell, with his military background, devised the infiltration plan. Clara, Otis, and the others volunteered to create distractions and provide backup. The goal was simple: infiltrate the building, access Alden's private vault on the top floor, and retrieve the evidence that would dismantle his empire for good. The night of the operation arrived, and the city was eerily quiet. Wisdom and his core team approached the skyscraper under the cover of darkness, blending into the shadows. Clara and Otis had created a diversion across town, setting off a series of small explosions that drew Alden's security forces away from the building. Inside, Darnell guided them through the security grid using a tablet linked to the building systems. Cameras are down in the West Wing. Move now. The team moved swiftly, their footsteps silent on the polished floors. They bypassed locked doors and patrolling guards, their progress smooth, until the unexpected happened. A sudden alarm blared, the sound piercing and relentless. Darnell's voice crackled through their earpieces. They found the breach. Guards are heading your way. You've got 3 minutes tops. Maxwell cursed under his breath. We're running out of time. Wisdom, go for the vault. I'll hold them off. No, Wisdom said firmly. We stick together. If we split up, we're done. But Maxwell shook his head, a fierce determination in his eyes. This is bigger than me. You're the only one who can finish this. Now go. Reluctantly, Wisdom nodded, gripping Maxwell's shoulder. Be careful. Wisdom and Darnell reached the top floor, their breaths ragged as they approached the massive steel doors of the vault. The keypad glowed ominously, but Darnell was already at work, his fingers flying over the tablet. Hurry, Wisdom urged, glancing over his shoulder. The sound of approaching guards grew louder. I'm going as fast as I can. Darnell snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, the vault doors hissed open, revealing rows of shelves lined with files, hard drives, and cash. At the center of the room sat a reinforced safe, its contents unknown. Grab everything, Wisdom ordered, stuffing files and drives into a duffel bag. Darnell focused on the safe, bypassing its lock with a mix of skill and sheer luck. When it clicked open, both men froze. Inside was a single hard drive, its surface marked with Alden's personal insignia. This is it, Darnell whispered. The master key to his entire empire. Wisdom took the drive, his heart pounding. Let's go. The team's escape was chaotic. Guards swarmed the building, their shouts echoing through the halls. Maxwell rejoined them, bloodied but alive, as they fought their way to the exit. The truck was waiting outside, driven by Clara. She gunned the engine as the team piled in, bullets ricocheting off the vehicle as they sped away. In the back seat, Wisdom clutched the hard drive like a lifeline. "We've got it," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We've got everything we need to take Alden down." Maxwell nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Then let's make sure he never sees it coming." The truck barreled through the empty streets of the industrial district, its tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. Inside, the tension was palpable. Clara navigated with precision, avoiding any main roads to prevent detection. Everyone was battered and bruised, but the prize, Alden's hard drive, rested securely in Wisdom's hands. "We need to move fast," Darnell said, breaking the tense silence. "If Alden figures out we've got his data, he'll unleash hell to get it back." "He already knows," Maxwell grunted, clutching his side where a bullet had grazed him. "Those guards weren't just there for show. They'll be hunting us as soon as they regroup." Wisdom nodded, his face a mask of determination. "Then we hit him first. This hard drive contains everything: bank accounts, transactions, deals, names of his allies and enemies. If we leak this strategically, we'll destroy his empire piece by piece." Clara glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Strategically? Won't dumping everything online be faster?" "No," Wisdom replied firmly. "Alden has too much influence. If we release everything at once, he'll use his connections to twist the narrative. We need to control the flow of information, expose him step by step so he can't recover." The team regrouped at an old printing warehouse owned by Otis. It was far enough from the city center to avoid immediate detection, but close enough for quick access to the networks they needed. The warehouse was cold and dimly lit, but it was the safest place they'd had in weeks. As Clara and Otis patched up Maxwell's wounds, Darnell set up his equipment on a rickety wooden table. Wisdom paced the room, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on his shoulders. "We need to prioritize what to release first," he said. "Something explosive, but credible. Enough to shake Alden's foundation without putting our allies at risk." Darnell connected the hard drive to his laptop, his eyes scanning the trove of data. "There's enough dirt here to take down half the city's elite. Bribes, blackmail, money laundering. Alden didn't just build an empire. He built a web of corruption." Maxwell leaned against the wall, his voice grim. "Start with the politicians. Take out the people who've been shielding him. Once they're gone, Alden will lose his protection." By dawn, the team had crafted their first blow. Using a network of anonymous accounts and trusted contacts in the media, they released documents implicating several high-ranking officials in a bribery scheme orchestrated by Alden. The evidence was airtight: bank transfers, signed agreements, even incriminating emails. The fallout was immediate. News outlets picked up the story within hours, and social media exploded with outrage. Protesters gathered outside government buildings, demanding resignations and investigations. From his corner of the room, Darnell monitored Alden's response. "He's scrambling," he reported. "His people are issuing denials, but it's too late. The public's eating this up." Wisdom allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. This is just the beginning. But Alden wasn't going down without a fight. By midday, the team's safe house was compromised. Armed men stormed the printing warehouse, forcing the group to flee once again. As they weaved through the city in their battered truck, Clara cursed under her breath. "How are they finding us so quickly? We've been careful." "There's a mole," Maxwell growled, his expression dark. "Someone's feeding Alden our movements." Wisdom's mind raced. They had been so focused on the mission that they hadn't considered the possibility of betrayal. "We'll deal with that later. Right now, we need to stay ahead of them." Forced to abandon their plans temporarily, the team sought refuge with one of Wisdom's old contacts, a reclusive tech genius named Ayana. She lived in a fortified loft on the edge of the city, her home filled with advanced surveillance equipment and servers. Ayana greeted them with a wry smile. "So, the prodigal son returns. I heard you were making waves, but I didn't think you'd drag trouble to my doorstep." Trouble finds me whether I want it or not, Wisdom replied. We need your help, Ayana. Alden's got us cornered, but we've got the tools to take him down. We just need a better playing field. Ayana studied him for a moment before nodding. You're lucky I like a good fight. Let's see what you've got. With Ayana's resources and expertise, the team gained a new advantage. She enhanced their communication channels, created decoys to throw Alden's men off their trail, and even hacked into some of Alden's surveillance systems. As they prepared for their next move, Wisdom felt a renewed sense of hope. They had been on the defensive for too long, but now the scales were beginning to tip in their favor. This isn't just about taking down Alden anymore, Ayana said, her voice sharp. It's about exposing the rot that's infected this city for years. If we do this right, we don't just dismantle his empire. We rebuild something better. Wisdom met her gaze, his resolve hardening. Then let's finish what we started. A dark fog blanketed the city that night, shrouding its towering skyscrapers in an eerie stillness. At Ayana's fortified loft, the team worked tirelessly, their focus razor-sharp. Each person knew the stakes. They weren't just taking down Alden, but dismantling a system of corruption that had held the city hostage for decades. Ayana leaned back in her chair, her multiple screens glowing with lines of code. I've gained access to Alden's private communication network, she announced. We can see his every move. He's nervous, trying to plug leaks and silence anyone who might betray him. Wisdom stood behind her, his jaw clenched. Good. If he's panicking, he's vulnerable. What's our next target? Darnell swiveled his chair around, holding up a tablet. There's a hidden offshore account funneling bribes to key players in Alden's network. If we expose this, we can take down his financial lifeline. But it won't be easy. These accounts are protected by layers of encryption. Ayana smirked. You're lucky you brought me in. I'll crack it, but it'll take time. Meanwhile, you should prepare for the fallout. Once we hit him there, Alden will go nuclear. The next day, Ayana executed the plan with surgical precision. Within hours, documents linking Alden to the offshore accounts flooded the media. Anonymous tips sent to international financial regulators added weight to the exposure, prompting immediate investigations. The impact was devastating. Alden's financial empire, once a fortress of untouchable wealth, began to crumble. Banks froze his accounts, allies abandoned him, and the city's elites scrambled to distance themselves from the fallout. At a small cafe near Ayana's loft, Wisdom watched the news unfold on a muted television. Images of angry protests and breaking news banners dominated the screen. Clara sat across from him, sipping her coffee. It's working, she said quietly. But Alden won't take this lying down. He'll strike back harder than ever. Wisdom nodded, his expression grim. Let him. The more desperate he gets, the more mistakes he'll make. But Alden was far from beaten. That evening, Ayana detected unusual activity on Alden's network. He's baiting us, she said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. There's a false trail leading to a supposed vault with more incriminating evidence. It's a trap, but he's betting we'll fall for it. Maxwell frowned. So, what do we do? Ignore it? No, Wisdom said firmly. We spring the trap, but on our terms. Let Alden think he's in control while we turn it against him. Ayana nodded, a spark of excitement in her eyes. I can manipulate his network, make him think we're taking the bait. Meanwhile, you hit his real weak point, his personal estate. It's where he's hiding what's left of his assets. Under the cover of darkness, the team approached Alden's sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. It was a fortress of luxury, surrounded by high walls, motion sensors, and armed guards. Using Ayana's surveillance feed, the team avoided the most heavily guarded areas and slipped inside. The estate was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint hum of security drones circling above. Inside, the team worked quickly, combing through Alden's study, safe rooms, and hidden compartments. They found stacks of documents, encrypted devices, and a collection of photographs linking Alden to high-profile criminal activities. Jackpot, Darnell whispered, carefully packing the evidence into a bag. But as they prepared to leave, an alarm blared, and the estate's lights flooded the grounds. Armed guards swarmed the estate, their weapons drawn. The team scrambled for cover, using the opulent furniture and architecture to shield themselves. Wisdom's heart pounded as he led his team toward an emergency exit. But before they could escape, a chilling voice echoed through the estate's sound system. "Impressive," Alden's voice drawled. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long, Wisdom. But this ends now." Wisdom clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. "You've ruined too many lives, Alden. This ends when the truth destroys you." Alden laughed, the sound cold and venomous. "Truth? The truth doesn't matter if no one lives to tell it." Suddenly, a hail of gunfire erupted, forcing the team to scatter. Maxwell covered the team as they fought their way to the emergency exit. Darnell, carrying the bag of evidence, stumbled but was quickly pulled to safety by Clara. When they finally burst through the gates, Clara had already hotwired a nearby car. The team piled in, the sound of gunfire fading as they sped away into the night. As they drove, Ayana's voice crackled through the comms. "Did you get it?" Wisdom looked at the bag of evidence and nodded. "We got it. But Alden knows we're coming for him. He won't stop until one of us falls." Back at Ayana's loft, the team reviewed the evidence they had collected. It was a treasure trove of information, enough to destroy Alden's empire completely. "This is it," Darnell said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "We have everything we need to bring him down." Wisdom nodded, his expression resolute. "Then let's end this." But as they prepared to execute their final strike, Ayana's screens flashed with an urgent alert. "Alden's launched a counterattack," she said, her voice tense. "He's targeting our allies, shutting down their operations one by one. If we don't act now, we'll lose everything." Wisdom's heart sank, but he quickly steeled himself. "Then we fight back with everything we've got." Alden's counterattack hit like a hurricane, striking fear into the hearts of the city. Businesses aligned with Wisdom's allies were burned to the ground. Journalists who dared report the truth received ominous threats, and community leaders disappeared overnight. The city was spiraling into chaos, with Alden's men ruthlessly silencing dissent. At Ayana's loft, the team watched in stunned silence as the news played out on multiple screens. Protesters who had once cheered the leaks now huddled in fear, and the city's officials, previously under scrutiny, began closing ranks to protect themselves. "This is worse than we expected," Darnell muttered, pacing the room. "Alden's not just trying to shut us down. He's trying to crush anyone who might stand up to him." Wisdom sat in a corner, his head bowed in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but filled with resolve. "He's overextending. The more he lashes out, the more people will see him for what he truly is, a desperate tyrant." "But what about the collateral damage?" Clara asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Innocent people are getting hurt because of this fight." Wisdom looked up, his gaze fierce. "Then we end it now. No more waiting, no more pieces. This time, we expose everything. Every deal, every crime, every name. If Alden wants war, we'll give him one." The team spent the next 48 hours preparing for the most ambitious move yet. Ayana worked tirelessly, creating a massive digital package of evidence that could be distributed to every corner of the city and beyond. The files were encrypted with multiple fail-safes, ensuring they couldn't be taken down once released. Meanwhile, Maxwell and Clara coordinated with underground networks, rallying community leaders and activists to prepare for a citywide protest. The goal wasn't just to expose Alden, but to empower the people to take back control. "This isn't just about toppling a king," Maxwell said as he handed out burner phones and maps. "It's about dismantling the entire throne. If we don't give the people something to believe in, this cycle will just repeat." The night of the final move, Ayana's loft became the nerve center for a citywide operation. As midnight approached, the team activated their plan. Ayana's voice echoed through the room as she typed furiously. "Files are uploading to every major news outlet, independent journalist, and public forum. In 10 minutes, the whole world will see Alden for what he truly is." Outside, Maxwell and Clara led a coordinated effort to light up the city. Graffiti calling for justice appeared on every wall, projection screens displayed incriminating evidence, and crowds gathered in the streets, demanding change. At his fortified mansion, Alden watched the chaos unfold with growing fury. His phone rang incessantly as allies called to distance themselves from the fallout. On his monitors, he saw the evidence spreading like wildfire, unstoppable and damning. In a fit of rage, he smashed a glass against the wall. "They think they've won," he snarled. "But they don't know what I'm capable of." Turning to his remaining loyalists, he barked orders. "Find them. Burn their safe houses. If they want war, I'll give them a massacre." As the city rose against Alden's empire, the team found themselves cornered. Alden's men had tracked them to Ayana's loft, and the sound of helicopters and approaching vehicles filled the air. "We're out of time," Darnell said, his face pale. Wisdom grabbed the hard drive containing their master files and turned to the team. "We're not done yet. Ayana, trigger the final release. Maxwell, get everyone out of here. I'll hold them off." Maxwell stepped forward, his voice firm. "No way. We're not leaving you behind." "You don't have a choice," Wisdom said, his tone unyielding. "If this mission fails, everything we've fought for will mean nothing." Ayana's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "The release is ready. Once I hit enter, Alden's entire network will be exposed, and his empire will collapse." Wisdom nodded. "Then do it. And no matter what happens, keep fighting." As the team evacuated, Wisdom stayed behind, barricading the doors and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. He watched from the window as armed men surrounded the building, their weapons glinting under the streetlights. With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and recorded a message, his voice steady despite the storm outside. "To the people of this city, this fight is not just mine. It's ours. Alden's reign ends tonight, but the battle for justice is far from over. Stand together, demand better, and never stop fighting for what's right." He sent the video to Ayana just as the first gunshots shattered the windows. As the evidence spread, the city erupted in protest. Alden's empire crumbled in real time, his allies abandoning him and his assets frozen by international authorities. But inside the loft, the battle raged on. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, a desperate last stand that left the fate of Wisdom uncertain. In the aftermath, the city began to heal. The people, inspired by the team's bravery, reclaimed their streets and demanded systemic change. Alden was arrested, his power stripped away, but questions lingered about Wisdom's fate. Clara stood in the middle of a bustling crowd, her eyes scanning the horizon. "He wouldn't just disappear," she murmured. "Wisdom always has a plan." And somewhere, in the shadows of the city, a figure watched silently, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge.